Here are a few options for a short, engaging intro, ranging in tone. Option 1. Thematic and poetic. In a valley cracking under the hammer of a year-long drought, hope has turned to dust. For farmer Elias, the only thing growing is his debt, and the bank's final warning is a promise the sky refuses to keep. But while Elias sees only an ending, his young son believes a single cup of water can still perform a miracle for one dying sunflower, an act of foolishness, or the first drop in a storm of change. Option 2. Character-focused and direct. After 364 days without rain, Elias has accepted the death of his farm. The crops are ghosts, the soil is dust, and the bank is coming to collect the bones. But his 7-year-old son, Leo, refuses to surrender. Armed with a watering can and a faith as stubborn as the sun, he's about to make a stand for a single, withered flower, proving that even in a thirsty world, hope only dies if you let it. Option 3. Short and punchy. The land is dead. The well is dry. For farmer Elias, the future is a foreclosure notice nailed to his door. But in the heart of all this desolation, one small boy with a watering can is about to remind a forgotten valley that it only takes a single seed and a little bit of faith to start a revolution. Chapter 1. The Thirsty Earth. The sun over the valley of Viridia was no longer a giver of life, but a hammer. It beat down upon the land with a relentless, metallic fury, forging the earth into a cracked and brittle plate. For 364 days, it had presided over a cloudless, mocking sky, a great, white eye that refused to blink. The land, once a tapestry of emerald and gold, was now a monochrome study in brown and gray. In the village of Oakhaven, nestled in what was once the most fertile fold of the valley, hope was a currency they could no longer afford. It had been spent in the first few months, bartered for promises of next week's rain, then for government subsidies that were too little, too late. Now, all that remained was a brittle resignation, as cracked and barren as the fields themselves. Elias watched this desolation from the porch of his small farmhouse. The wood of the railing was hot and splintery beneath his calloused palm. His gaze swept over the land that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. Where rows of proud corn should have stood, their green banners rustling in the breeze, there were only skeletal stalks, withered and bent as if in prayer for a death that had already come. The pumpkin patch, once his son's particular delight, was a graveyard of shriveled, orange husks, collapsed in on themselves like rotten lungs. He sifted a handful of soil through his fingers. It wasn't soil anymore. It was dust, fine, gray, and lifeless. It coated his hand in a funereal powder, leaving no trace of the rich, dark loam he remembered. This dust was the ghost of his farm, the ghost of his future. It was in the air they breathed, a constant, gritty reminder of their failure. It settled on the windowsills, coated the back of his throat, and dusted his wife Anya's dark hair as she hung the laundry that was stiff before it was even dry. A heavy sigh, laden with the weight of a year's worth of unspoken fear, escaped his lips. The bank had sent another letter. The polite, sterile words were seared into his memory. Regret to inform you. Current arrears, exploring all available options. He knew what those options were. He had seen the grim-faced men in city cars drive out to the Miller farm on the other side of the valley. He had seen the Miller family's possessions piled by the side of the road, small monuments to a life undone. The screen door creaked open behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was his son. "Papa." The voice was small, but it cut through the oppressive silence of the heat. Elias forced his shoulders to relax, schooling his face into a mask of weary calm before he turned. Leo stood there, a 7-year-old boy with his mother's deep brown eyes and a thatch of unruly hair the color of sun-bleached straw. In his small hands, he clutched a tin watering can, one that was usually reserved for his mother's window box geraniums. The can was barely a quarter full, sloshing with a precious pint of their rationed water. "What is it, Leo?" Elias's voice was rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the dust and his own despair. Leo seemed not to notice. His gaze was fixed on a single, defiant spot of color at the edge of the porch steps. It was a sunflower, a volunteer that had sprouted from a seed dropped by a bird in happier times. It was a pathetic thing, its stalk thin and bent, its head bowed under the weight of the sun, the once vibrant yellow petals now a sickly, curled brown at the edges. Yet it clung to life. "She's thirsty," Leo said, his voice filled with a simple, profound certainty. He tipped the watering can, and a dark circle of moisture bloomed in the dust around the sunflower's base, instantly devoured by the parched earth. He watched it disappear with an expression of intense concentration, as if he could will the water to travel up the stalk and revive the dying petals through sheer force of will. A pang of something sharp and painful twisted in Elias's gut. It was love, so fierce it felt like grief. This boy, his boy, was trying to save a single flower with a cup of water while their whole world was turning to desert. The futility of the act was a perfect, heartbreaking miniature of his own struggle. "Leo," he began, his voice softening. That's good of you. But you should save the water. For drinking." Leo looked up, his brow furrowed. "But God made the flowers, Papa. He wouldn't want them to be thirsty." The simple, unshakable logic of a child. God made the flowers. God made the rain. Why had he forgotten to connect the two? Elias had no answer. He had shouted his own questions at the empty sky in the dead of night, his words swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. He had knelt in the village church, the scent of old wood and candle wax thick in his nostrils, and found only echoes. "Yes, son," he said, ruffling Leo's hair. The fine dust rose in a small cloud. He wouldn't. He looked back at the dead fields. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Later that afternoon, when the heat was at its most suffocating, Leo slipped out of the house. His mother was mending a tear in his father's work shirt, her needle moving with a slow, rhythmic precision that did little to hide the tension in her shoulders. His father was in the barn, staring at machinery he had no fuel to run, for fields he had no crops to harvest. Leo knew they were sad. The sadness in the house was a physical thing, thick and heavy like the air before a storm that never came. He felt it in the way his mother's hugs were a little too tight, a little too long. He felt it in the way his father's laughter, once a booming, frequent sound, had become a rare and rusty thing. They thought he didn't understand the words on the official-looking papers, the hushed conversations after he was in bed, the way his mother would sometimes just stop what she was doing and stare out the window at the road. But he did. He understood the feeling, if not the details. It was the feeling of less. Less food on the table. Less water in the well. Less laughter in the air. He walked past the withered garden, his small bare feet padding softly on the baked earth. He followed the path that led down to Oakhaven Creek. A year ago, this path had been flanked by lush ferns and wildflowers, and the sound of rushing water would have been a constant, happy murmur. Now, the silence was absolute. The creek bed was a scar on the land, a deep, winding wound of cracked gray mud and smooth, sun-bleached stones. Skeletons of small fish, delicate as lace, lay trapped in the hardened clay. This was where his father had taught him to skip stones, where they had come to cool their feet on hot summer days. Now, it was a place of ghosts. Leo walked to the center of the dry bed, to the deepest part where a small pool would linger for weeks even in the driest of summers. It, too, was gone. The mud was fractured into a mosaic of deep, thirsty cracks. He knelt, placing his small hands on the warm, hard surface. He closed his eyes, his face scrunched in concentration, trying to remember the feel of the cool water, the sound it made as it tumbled over the rocks. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, a voice meant for an audience of one, he began to pray. He didn't use the formal words he heard in church on Sundays. He didn't know how. He just spoke, as if talking to a friend he hadn't seen in a long time. "Hello, God," he began, his whisper absorbed by the vast, hot silence. "It's me, Leo. From the farm with the sad sunflower. My papa is sad, too. His face looks like the ground. All cracked. And Mama, she tries to smile, but her eyes are leaking sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "The thing is, the earth is very, very thirsty. The flowers are thirsty. The corn is thirsty. I think maybe you forgot. It's okay. You have a lot to do. But if you could just remember us, if you could send the rain, I think Papa would smile again. A real smile. And the sunflower could be yellow again. Please. We just need the rain. Amen." He stayed there for a long moment, kneeling in the heart of the dead creek, his eyes squeezed shut. He waited, listening. But the only sound was the faint, high-pitched hum of a cicada, a desperate, lonely song in the overwhelming heat. He did not know he was being watched. Father Thomas stood in the shade of a skeletal willow tree on the bank, its long, drooping branches leafless and brittle. He had been on his way to visit the Hemlock family, whose matriarch was fading as surely as the land itself. He had taken the shortcut through the creek bed out of habit, a habit formed in greener years. He had stopped when he saw the small figure kneeling in the sun. He had heard every word. The priest was a man worn smooth by the faith of others. For 40 years, he had been the spiritual shepherd of Oakhaven. He had christened its babies, married its young lovers, and buried its dead. He offered prayers for rain every Sunday, his voice resonant and practiced, the words flowing from him with the comfortable familiarity of a well-worn path. But lately, the path had felt hollow. His own prayers seemed to rise no higher than the dusty rafters of the church, their Latin and King James English too ornate, too heavy to ascend to a heaven that felt impossibly distant. He was ministering to a flock whose faith was dying of thirst, and he feared his own was not far behind. And then he heard this, a child's prayer, so simple, so direct. "Maybe you forgot." It was not an accusation, but a gentle reminder, offered with a pure, untarnished belief that the listener was good and kind and merely distracted. There was no desperation in the boy's tone, no anger, only a quiet, earnest trust. Father Thomas felt a strange stirring in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It was a faint ache, a ghost of the fervent, unshakable faith he had possessed as a young seminarian. He watched as Leo finally stood, dusted off his knees, and started the slow walk back to the farmhouse, his small shoulders slumped just a little. The priest did not call out. He did not want to disturb the sanctity of the moment he had witnessed. He remained in the shade of the dead willow, the child's whispered words echoing in the silence. "If you could send the rain, I think Papa would smile again." It was the smallest, most personal of requests, woven into the largest of needs. It was not a prayer for harvests or profits or the salvation of a nation. It was a prayer for a father's smile. And in that moment, Father Thomas felt with a startling certainty that it was the most powerful prayer he had ever heard. The following Sunday, the Church of St. Jude the Hopeful was filled, as it always was. Attendance had not flagged during the drought. If anything, it had increased. People came seeking something, solace, a miracle, or perhaps just an hour's respite from the glaring sun and the sight of their dying land. They sat in the heavy wooden pews, their faces etched with a familiar, communal weariness. They fanned themselves with hymn books, the rustling of the pages like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a road. Elias, Anya, and Leo were in their usual pew, third from the front on the left. Elias sat stiffly, his mind on the letter from the bank, on the depleting stores in the pantry. Anya held Leo's hand, her expression serene, though her knuckles were white. Father Thomas mounted the pulpit. The sun, streaming through the stained glass window depicting a lush Garden of Eden, cast mocking jewels of green and blue light across the dusty floor. He looked out at his congregation, at the faces he had known his entire life. He saw Marcus Thorne, the old farmer whose cynicism was as legendary as his prize-winning bulls had once been. He saw Alara, the baker's wife, her eyes already scanning the crowd for any new tidbit of gossip. He saw Isabel, the young schoolteacher, whose face still held a flicker of optimism that had been extinguished in most of the others. He opened his Bible, the pages thin and soft as moth wings. He had prepared a sermon on the trials of Job, a familiar and fitting text for the times. He intended to speak of endurance, of faith in the face of inscrutable suffering. He cleared his throat. "My dear friends," he began, his voice filling the hushed space. "We gather again under a sky that offers no relief. We come with hearts heavy with the dust of our fields and the weight of our worries. We ask ourselves, how long, O Lord? How long must we endure this tria? He paused, his eyes sweeping over the tired faces. The words of Job felt suddenly inadequate, like offering a stone to a man starving for bread. He looked down at his Bible, at the elegant, ancient text. And then he looked up, but he was no longer seeing the congregation. He was seeing a small boy kneeling in a dry creek bed, his face tilted towards an empty sky. He closed the book. A soft murmur rippled through the church. The priest never closed the book. "I had intended to speak to you today about the patience of Job," Father Thomas said, his voice softer now, more intimate. "About the nature of faith in the crucible of suffering. But this week, I learned a lesson in faith not from a great prophet, but from one of the smallest among us." He let his gaze rest on Leo for just a moment. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. Elias and Anya exchanged a puzzled glance. "I was walking by the old creek," the priest continued. "A place of sorrow for us now, a reminder of all we have lost. And there, in the deepest, driest part of the creek bed, I saw a child. He was on his knees, and he was praying." The rustling of hymn books stopped. The church was utterly silent. "I did not mean to eavesdrop," Father Thomas said, but his words carried on the still air. He did not use grand phrases. He did not quote scripture. He did not beg or bargain. He spoke to God as one would speak to a friend who had been away on a long journey. He described the sadness of his parents, the thirst of a single sunflower. And then he said something that has not left my thoughts since. He said, "I think maybe you forgot. It's okay. You have a lot to do. But if you could just remember us." He looked out at the faces before him. Marcus Thorne's scowl had deepened. But Alara, the baker's wife, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining. Isabel, the schoolteacher, was leaning forward, a soft, wondrous smile on her lips. Anya had pulled Leo closer, her arm wrapped tightly around his shoulders, her own eyes glistening with tears. Elias stared at his son, a look of profound astonishment on his face. "We," Father Thomas said, his voice regaining its strength, "we have been praying with desperation. We have been praying with anger, with fear, with the memory of what we once had. We have demanded. We have pleaded. We have lamented. But this child," he prayed with simple, unburdened love. He prayed not to change God's mind, but to gently remind him of a small, thirsty corner of his creation. He did not ask for a miracle to save his farm. He asked for rain to make his father smile. The priest's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it seemed to fill every corner of the church. Perhaps we have forgotten how to pray. Perhaps our faith has become as complicated and as brittle as our lives. We have been looking for a thunderclap, a great sign from heaven. But maybe the answer we seek begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. A child's whisper in a dry riverbed. He did not say another word. He simply stood in the pulpit, the closed Bible resting under his hand, and let the silence settle. It was a different kind of silence than before. It was not empty. It was full of thought, of wonder, of a strange and fragile new feeling that no one in Oakhaven had felt for a very long time. It felt like a drop of rain on parched ground. The sermon was the only thing anyone spoke of after the service. The story of Leo's prayer spread through the village square like a grass fire, leaping from person to person with a speed that gossip-monger Alara could only dream of. A child's prayer, she said to a group of women by the dry town fountain, her voice uncharacteristically hushed and full of awe. He just asked God to remember. It's a sweet story, grumbled Marcus Thorne to his friends leaning against the wall of the general store. But stories don't fill the well. We need a geologist, not a saint. His words were dismissive, but his eyes kept flicking over to where Elias stood with his family, surrounded by a small, curious crowd. Elias was uncomfortable with the attention. He was a private man, his worries held close to his chest. Now, his family's private pain and his son's private hope had been laid bare for the whole village to see. People clapped him on the shoulder, their eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was more than pity. It was a kind of shared, vicarious hope. Your boy, he has a strong heart, Elias, said Old Man Hemlock, his voice thin and reedy. He's a good lad, Elias mumbled, placing a protective hand on Leo's head. Leo himself was bewildered. He didn't understand what all the fuss was about. He had just talked to God. Wasn't that what they were supposed to do? He clung to his mother's hand, half hidden behind her skirt, peering out at the sea of adult faces. It was Isabel, the schoolteacher, who changed the course of the day. She made her way through the crowd to where Father Thomas was standing, his face still holding the calm solemnity of his sermon. Father, she said, her voice clear and steady. What you said today, it was beautiful, but a whisper can be lost in the wind. The priest looked at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean, my child? I mean, Isabel continued, her cheeks flushed with passion, that one child's whisper is beautiful. But what about the whispers of all our children? What if we added our voices to his? Not as a demand, but as a reminder, just as he said. A circle of people had gathered around them, listening intently. The boy prayed in the creek bed, Isabel said, her idea taking shape as she spoke. The place of our loss. What if we all went there? Not just the children. All of us. What if we stood together in that broken place and offered a single, simple prayer? Not for ourselves, but for each other. For the land. What if we showed God that we haven't forgotten him and asked him, gently, to remember us? The idea hung in the hot, still air. It was radical in its simplicity. It was not a protest. It was not a formal church service. It was something else entirely. A pilgrimage of the desperate. Marcus Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh. And what? We'll stand in the mud and pray. The sun will laugh at us. Let it laugh, Isabel countered, her eyes flashing. We have faced its scorn for a year. We can face it for one more hour. What have we to lose, Marcus? What is left to lose? The old farmer had no answer. Her words struck a chord, dislodging the cynicism that had taken root in so many hearts. What did they have to lose? Their pride? It had long since been baked to dust. Father Thomas looked from Isabel's earnest face to the crowd, and then to Leo, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. The priest saw the path forward, not laid out in Scripture, but in the hopeful eyes of a teacher and the simple faith of a child. This evening, Father Thomas announced, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction that startled even himself. At sunset, we will gather at the Oakhaven Creek Bridge. We will walk together into the heart of our sorrow, and we will pray. We will let our voices join the one that has already been offered. A murmur of assent, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, moved through the crowd. Elias looked at Anya, his eyes filled with a storm of doubt and a terrible, fragile flicker of hope. She squeezed his hand and gave a small, firm nod. This was not about logic. This was not about the probability of rain. This was about standing together. It was about refusing to let the dust have the final word. As the sun began its slow, merciless descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, a strange energy filled the village of Oakhaven. People who had not looked their neighbors in the eye for months, ashamed of their own and each other's poverty, began to talk. Plans were made. Candles were gathered. Leo stood on his porch, watching the sky blush with the colors of the sunset, orange, pink, and a deep, bruised purple. The colors were beautiful, but they were the colors of a dry sky, a sky that held no promise. In his hand, he clutched the single, wilting sunflower from the side of the porch. He had carefully uprooted it, its roots trailing a small clump of dry soil. He didn't know why, but he felt it was important. The sunflower was thirsty, too. It should be there when they prayed. He looked toward the village, toward the bridge over the dry creek. He could see them, small figures emerging from their homes, walking in ones and twos, then in small groups. A quiet, solemn procession moving through the twilight. They were coming. They were all coming to join his whisper. He looked at his father, who stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the growing crowd. The lines of despair on Elias's face were still there, but for the first time in a year, they were joined by something else. A profound and fearful wonder. The nation did not yet know the name Leo, or the village of Oakhaven. The capital city, with its politicians and meteorologists, was oblivious, concerned only with water reserves and economic forecasts. They knew nothing of the sermon, or the teacher's idea, or the boy with the sunflower. But here, in this forgotten corner of a thirsty land, a movement was being born. It was not born of anger or rebellion. It was born of a child's simple, loving prayer, a prayer that was about to be magnified 100-fold, a prayer that was beginning its journey to move a nation. Chapter 2. A River of Whispers. The procession moved not with the solemn, ordered gait of a funeral, but with the hesitant shuffle of people walking in a dream. As the sun bled its last colors below the bruised horizon, the path from Oakhaven to the old creek bridge became a slow-moving tributary of flickering lights. They carried what they had: tallow candles cupped in calloused hands, old storm lanterns with the wicks turned low, a few battery-powered torches that cast stark, nervous cones of white. The light danced on weary faces, carving deep shadows into the hollows of their cheeks, but igniting a new and unfamiliar spark in their eyes. Elias walked with Anya's hand in his, a small, warm anchor in the sea of his uncertainty. Leo walked between them, clutching his uprooted sunflower, its bowed head a small, dark planet in the miniature solar system of their family. The boy's face was serene, his expression one of quiet purpose. To him, this was not an act of desperation. It was a simple, logical extension of his conversation in the creek bed. He had invited God to remember, and now he was bringing his friends along to say hello. For Elias, every step was a battle. One foot, planted in the dust of practicality, screamed at the futility of it all. This is a fool's errand. A child's game. The bankers in the city aren't watching. The clouds aren't listening. But the other foot, the one that moved forward, was pulled by an invisible current, a force he could not name. It was the sight of old man Hemlock, who could barely walk to the general store, now leaning on his granddaughter's arm, his face tilted towards the darkening sky. It was the sound of Marcus Thorne's heavy, reluctant tread somewhere behind them, a grudging participant who could not bear to be the only one left behind. It was the soft, collective sigh of a village breathing as one, a sound he had not heard in a year. They were a river of weary souls, flowing towards the scar on the land that had once been their lifeblood. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of boots on dry earth and the occasional cough, quickly stifled. It was not an empty silence. It was a vessel, being filled with the unspoken grief and the fragile, nascent hope of every person there. When they reached the bridge, a skeletal span of weathered wood, Father Thomas was waiting. He held no Bible, wore no special vestments. He was just a man, one of them, his face illuminated by the single lantern at his feet. He did not speak. He simply turned and led the way down the crumbling embankment into the vast, open wound of the creek bed. The crowd followed, spilling down into the hollow, the scattered lights making them look like a fallen constellation. They spread out across the cracked mud, finding places among the smooth, pale stones that shone like bones in the twilight. They were an impossible garden, planted in the dead heart of the valley. Elias found a spot near the center, not far from a massive, bleached sycamore root that clawed at the air like the hand of a drowned giant. He looked at the faces around him. Alara, the baker's wife, her usual mask of knowing gossip stripped away, revealing a woman terrified for her children's future. Isabel, the teacher, her expression one of fierce, concentrated faith, as if she could personally will the clouds into existence. He saw the Millers, the family who had lost their farm, standing at the edge of the crowd, having returned to the valley not for their possessions, but for this. For a reason he could not yet comprehend, their presence sent a sharp, painful jolt through him. Father Thomas raised a hand, not for silence, for he already had it, but as a signal to begin. "There are no words I can offer that are greater than the ones already in your hearts," he said, his voice quiet, unamplified, forcing them to lean in. "We are not here to demand or to bargain. We are here, in this place of our sorrow, to remember and to ask to be remembered. Speak from your heart. Speak for your neighbor. Speak for the land. Let your whispers rise together." He bowed his head, and the ceremony, such as it was, began. At first, there was nothing but the vast, listening quiet of the valley. A cricket chirped, its lonely song emphasizing the stillness. Then, a single voice, thin and quavering. It was old Mrs. Hemlock. "For the soil," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Another voice joined hers, a young farmer near the bank. "For the seeds that lie sleeping. For my children's empty bellies," a woman sobbed quietly. "For my father's empty hands," a young man murmured, his gaze on Elias. Then, the whispers began to swell. It was not a chorus, but a multitude of solos, a tapestry of quiet, desperate, loving appeals. They were prayers for lost cattle and withered gardens, for unpaid bills and fraying marriages, for the return of laughter and the simple pleasure of a muddy boot. The names of children and grandparents, of fields and barren orchards, were offered up into the cooling air. Elias stood rigid, a stone against the current. His throat was tight, the words locked behind a dam of pride and despair. He could not pray. To whom? To the empty sky that had mocked him for 365 days? To the God who had watched his father's legacy turn to dust? The anger, the deep, bitter anger he had suppressed for months, coiled in his gut. Then he felt a tug at his hand. He looked down. Leo was looking up at him, his small face serious in the candlelight. He held out the sunflower. "Help me, Papa," he whispered. "She needs to be planted." The request was so simple, so absurd. To plant a dying flower in the baked clay of a dead creek. It was madness. It was the purest act of faith he had ever witnessed. Something inside Elias broke. The dam of his anger, his pride, his suffocating reason, it cracked. He looked at his son, whose faith was not a shield against reality, but a tool to remake it. He saw the trust in Leo's eyes, a trust not just in God, but in him. His father. He knelt. The hard, unforgiving clay pressed against his knees. He took the wilting flower from Leo's hand. He had no trowel, no spade. He used his bare hands, the hands that had once known the feel of rich, dark loam, and began to claw at the earth. The ground was like stone. It resisted, scraping his nails, jarring his wrists. The people nearby fell silent, their whispers dying as they turned to watch. The sound of his frantic digging was loud in the sudden stillness. He grunted, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He was not just digging a hole for a flower. He was digging through a year of his own hardened despair. He clawed at the unyielding earth, pouring all his frustration, his fear, and his rage into the act. Finally, the surface gave way. He pulled up a plate of dried mud, revealing a darker, faintly damp layer beneath. It was not moisture from above, but the deep, ancient memory of water. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Gently, he placed the sunflower's root ball into the small hollow. Leo knelt beside him, using his small hands to push the displaced earth back around the stem, patting it down with a tenderness that made Elias's heart ache. And then, Elias prayed. The words did not come from his mind, but from a deeper, more wounded place. They came out not as a request, but as a confession, a whisper meant only for the dust and the dark. "I'm sorry," he breathed, the words tearing at his throat. I forgot how." He looked at Leo, who had his eyes closed, one hand resting on the soil beside the planted flower. He looked at Anya, who was weeping silently, her face a mask of love and sorrow and a terrible, beautiful hope. He looked at his neighbors, their faces illuminated, their eyes fixed on his family, on this single, defiant act of planting life in the midst of death. He felt their whispers rise around him again, but this time they were different. They were no longer just individual pleas. They had found a focus. The whispers were for the sunflower, for the boy who had planted it, for the father who had knelt in the dust to help him. The sound swelled, a soft, rushing noise that filled the creek bed. It was the sound of 100 quiet heartbreaks, 100 fragile hopes, weaving together. It was not the roar of a river of water, but it was a river nonetheless. A river of whispers, flowing up from the floor of the valley, rising into the vast, silent, and listening sky. 5 miles away, on a lonely stretch of Highway 7 that skirted the northern edge of the Viridia Valley, a car with city plates sputtered to a halt. Benjamin Carter swore, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. A flat tire. On a road he hadn't seen another car on for 20 minutes, with the last dregs of twilight fading fast. Perfect. Ben was a journalist for the Capital Chronicle, a man whose natural cynicism had been honed to a razor's edge by years of covering political scandals and corporate malfeasance. The drought story was his penance for a scathing piece on a well-connected senator. He'd been sent to the parched countryside to write human interest pieces, tales of stoic farmers and dwindling reservoirs that the city folk could read over their morning coffee and feel a fleeting, comfortable pity. He hated it. It was a story of slow, boring death. There was no angle, no villain, no hero, just dust and sad people. He got out of the car, the dry heat of the asphalt rising through the soles of his shoes. He kicked the flat tire, a pointless act of frustration. He was about to retrieve the jack from his trunk when he saw it. A flicker of light down in the valley. Then another, and another. A whole cluster of them. His journalist's instincts, dormant for weeks, twitched. It wasn't a wildfire. The lights were too steady, too concentrated. It wasn't a town. Oakhaven, according to his map, was further south. Curiosity overriding his annoyance, he grabbed the heavy telephoto lens from his camera bag. He rested it on the roof of his car, aiming it towards the glow. The lens cut through the gloom, bringing the scene into sharp, grainy focus. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. It looked like the entire population of a small village was standing in what he belatedly realized was a dry riverbed. They were holding candles, their faces upturned. It was some kind of vigil. A religious ceremony? A protest? He couldn't tell. It was strange, deeply strange, and utterly compelling. He began snapping pictures, the rhythmic click of the shutter the only sound in the night. He zoomed in, trying to capture individual faces, the raw emotion etched upon them. Then his lens found the center of the gathering. A man and a small boy, kneeling in the dirt. The boy had his hand on something planted in the ground. The man was looking up, his face a raw canvas of exhaustion, and something else, something Ben's cynical mind struggled to label. It wasn't hope. It was more vulnerable than that. It was a surrender. Ben held his breath, his finger frozen on the shutter button. He felt like an intruder, a voyeur spying on a moment of profound and private communion. The sound, a faint, humming murmur, reached him even from this distance, carried on a breeze that had begun to stir the dead Lou. Avi's on the roadside. He couldn't make out words, but the feeling of it, it raised the hairs on his arms. These people weren't just sad. They were doing something. They were pouring their collective soul into this arid, broken piece of land. He lowered the camera, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar in his hands. He had come looking for a story about despair, about the end of things. But what he was witnessing felt like a beginning. He didn't understand it. But he knew, with a certainty that cut through his professional detachment, that it was the most important thing he had seen in a very long time. He took one more picture. A tight shot of the boy, Leo, his eyes closed, his small hand resting on the soil next to the impossibly fragile sunflower, the candlelight creating a halo in his sun-bleached hair. He didn't know it yet, but he had just captured the heart of the story that would change everything. The whisper that was about to become a roar. The walk back from the creek was different. The silence was gone, replaced by a low murmur of conversation. Neighbors who had passed each other with downcast eyes for months were now walking side by side, their candle flames bobbing in unison. They weren't talking about the drought, not directly. They were talking about their children, about recipes for stretching their dwindling supplies, about memories of past harvests. They were relearning the language of community. Marcus Thorne found himself walking beside Father Thomas. The old cynic cleared his throat. "That was a strange thing, Father." The priest smiled, his face weary but serene. "Faith often is, Marcus." "I'm not talking about faith," Marcus grumbled, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm talking about Elias. I've never seen him like that, digging in the dirt like a madman." "Perhaps," Father Thomas said softly, "he was just finding his way back to the earth." Elias, walking ahead, heard none of it. He was enveloped in a cocoon of his own making, with Anya on one side and Leo on the other. He carried the shovel he had borrowed to properly dig out the sunflower later that night, to give it a better chance. It felt strange and good in his hand, a familiar weight. He felt lighter. The iron band of despair that had been constricting his chest for a year had loosened, just a fraction. It hadn't vanished. The bank letter was still on his mantelpiece. The fields were still dead. The sky was still empty. Nothing had factually changed. But everything had changed. When they reached their farmhouse, the lights of the rest of the village dwindling behind them, Anya lit the lamp in the kitchen. Its warm, yellow glow seemed softer tonight, less harsh. Leo, exhausted but happy, had fallen asleep in his father's arms on the last stretch of the walk. Elias gently laid him in his bed, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. He stood for a moment, looking at his son's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. He saw the smudge of dirt on his cheek, a holy sacrament from the creek bed. He asked for rain to make his father smile. Elias felt the corner of his own mouth twitch, a painful, unfamiliar movement. He went back to the kitchen. Anya was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee. She looked up as he entered, her eyes asking the question she didn't dare speak. He sat down opposite her, reaching across the worn wooden table to take her hand. His own was caked with dry mud and scraped raw. "I don't know what happens tomorrow, Anya," he said, his voice raspy. "I don't know if it will ever rain." She squeezed his hand. "I know. But tonight." He paused, struggling to find the words. "Tonight, watching Leo, watching everyone. I felt like we weren't just waiting to die. We were alive. Down there, in that dead place, we were more alive than we've been in a year." Tears welled in Anya's eyes and spilled over, tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "I saw your face, Elias, when you were digging. It was the first time I've seen the real you in so long." He looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his grimy, calloused fingers and her slender, work-worn ones. the bank, the debt, the grim-faced men in their city cars. The threats were all still there, lined up on the horizon. But for the first time, they did not occupy the entire landscape of his mind. In the center, a new image had been planted. His son, on his knees, tending to a single, dying sunflower in the heart of a wasteland. An act of faith, an act of love, an act of defiance. "We won't lose this place, Anya," he said, the words coming out with a certainty that shocked him. He didn't know how. He had no plan. But the statement was not based on a strategy. It was a promise, forged in the dust and candlelight of the creek bed. It was his own prayer, offered not to the sky, but to the woman who was his rock and his harvest. Outside, a warm breeze began to blow, the first real wind they had felt in months. It whispered through the skeletal cornstalks, making them rustle and sigh. It carried the scent of dry earth and the distant, collective hope of a village that had dared to whisper back at the silence. It stirred the petals of the newly planted sunflower in the dark of the Oakhaven Creek, a promise of movement in a world that had been brutally still for far too long. The sky remained clear, a vast, star-dusted canvas of black. But for the first time in a year, it did not feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. Chapter 3: The Scent of Rain. The wind was the first apostle of the new faith. It arrived before dawn, not as a storm, but as a persistent, sighing breath that moved through the valley like a restless spirit. It was a sound Oakhaven had forgotten. For a year, the air had been a dead weight, a hot, stagnant blanket that smothered sound and motion. Now it was alive. It teased the brittle leaves on the oaks, creating a dry, shuffling percussion. It found the loose slat on Elias's barn roof and made it sing a low, mournful note. It swirled dust from the fallow fields into dancing dervishes that spun across the dirt road like frantic ghosts. Elias was awake to hear its genesis. He lay in the dark, Anya's sleeping form a warm, solid presence beside him, and he listened. It was a physical thing, this wind. He could feel it pressing against the old farmhouse, testing the window panes, speaking a language of movement and change. He rose, pulling on his worn jeans and a thin shirt, and went to Leo's room. His son was deeply asleep, his face peaceful, the smudge of holy dirt still on his cheek. The wind made the curtains by his open window billow and dance, and for a moment, they looked like white wings. Outside, the world was bathed in the pre-dawn indigo light that comes just before the sun asserts its dominion. The air was cooler, scrubbed clean of the oppressive heat that had lingered even through the nig. Heights Elias walked out onto his porch and took a deep breath. It was not the crisp, damp air that precedes a storm. It was dry, filled with the taste of the very dust it was stirring. And yet, it felt like a promise. It was the world turning in its sleep, beginning to dream of water. He found himself walking, his boots crunching on the gravel of the path that led away from the house. He was not guiding his feet. They were guiding him, pulling him back toward the creek. As he drew closer, he saw he was not alone. In the growing light, he could see other figures, solitary or in pairs, moving along the same trajectory. Old Man Hemlock, walking without his granddaughter's arm for support, his steps slow but determined. The Miller family, who had come back to the valley for a whisper and stayed for the wind. They were all being drawn back to the scene of their strange, shared sacrament. They gathered in the creek bed, a silent congregation of farmers and shopkeepers and teachers. No candles were lit this time. They stood in the gray light of morning, their faces turned not to the sky, but down to the earth, to a single, small patch of disturbed soil where Leo's sunflower stood. It had not performed a miracle. Its head was still bowed, its leaves still tinged with yellow. But it was undeniably, defiantly alive. The wind, which could have been its executioner, seemed to be treating it with a strange gentleness, rustling its petals like a caress. Someone had brought a jar of water, precious, rationed water from their own well, and had poured it carefully around the plant's base, creating a dark, damp circle in the pale, cracked clay. It was an offering, a libation. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They simply stood together, watching a dying flower refuse to die, and listened to the sound of the world breathing again. The iron band of despair had not just loosened in Elias's chest. He felt it had been lifted from the entire valley. In its place was a fragile, terrifying thing. A seed of hope, planted in the same hostile soil as the sunflower, tended by the same desperate hands. And like the flower, it had, against all odds, survived the night. The sun rose, casting long shadows from the skeletal sycamores, and found them there, a garden of silent watchers, waiting to see what the day would bring. Benjamin Carter drove his rental car, now sporting a donut spare tire, down Oakhaven's main street with the windows down, letting the dusty wind whip through the cabin. He'd spent a fitful night in a sterile motel room in the next county, the images he'd captured burning behind his eyelids. The faces in the candlelight, the boy with the flower, the raw, desperate energy of it all. He'd come to the Viridia Valley to write an obituary for a town. Instead, he felt like he'd stumbled upon a birth. Oakhaven in the daylight was even starker than he'd imagined. The paint was peeling on every storefront. The letters on the sign for the Oakhaven General Store faded and chipped. Dust coated everything, a fine, brown silt that muted all color, making the town look like an old, forgotten photograph. But there was a difference from the other dying towns he'd passed through. Here, the dust was not settled. It was in motion, stirred by the ceaseless wind. And the people were in motion, too. He saw them sweeping their porches with a new vigor, talking to each other over dilapidated fences, their voices carrying on the breeze. There was an energy here, a low hum of activity that belied the desolation of the landscape. He parked in front of the general store and went inside. The interior smelled of old wood, coffee, and something vaguely sweet, like molasses. A woman with flour dusting her forearms and a weary but intelligent look in her eyes stood behind the counter. She was bagging a few potatoes for an elderly customer. "Morning, Alara," the customer said. "Wind's up." "That it is, Mr. Hemlock." "The woman," Alara replied. Her voice was warm, with a hint of gravel. "Feels like the world's decided to turn a new page." Ben waited until the old man had shuffled out before he approached the counter. He pulled his camera from his bag and flipped through the images on the small screen until he found the one he was looking for, the tight shot of the boy with his hand on the soil. He turned the camera around and placed it on the counter. "I'm looking for this boy," he said. "And his father." Alara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the tiny, illuminated image. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuinely beautiful thing that seemed to momentarily erase the lines of worry etched around her eyes. "Leo," she said, her voice soft with affection. "And Elias. So, you were the one on the highway." It wasn't a question. News, even of a distant flicker of light, traveled fast here. "I'm a journalist," Ben said, feeling the need to state his credentials, though it felt hollow now. "With the Capital Chronicle." Her smile didn't falter, but a cautious veil dropped over her eyes. Journalists were vultures, circling bad news. "Come for another story about the poor, dying farmers?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I thought I was," Ben answered, his honesty surprising even himself. "But I don't think that's the story here. Not anymore." He looked at her directly. "Something happened last night. I don't know what it was, but I'd like to understand." Alara studied his face for a long moment, searching for the cynical glint of a man looking for an angle, a sob story to exploit. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, seemed to satisfy her. "The Walker farm," she said, pointing through the dusty front window. "Go about 2 miles down that road. It's the last one on the left, the one with the big oak that's given up the ghost. You can't miss it." She paused, then added, her voice dropping lower. "Be gentle with him. With Elias. He's been carrying this whole valley on his shoulders, and his spine is just about worn through. Hope is not a currency, Elias. Marcus Thorne's words were a bucket of cold, practical water, but Elias had expected nothing less. He had gathered Marcus, David Miller, and a few other farmers in his barn. The big doors were open, and the wind blew straight through, carrying the scent of hay and dust and ancient anxieties. It might not be, Elias countered, leaning against a stack of empty feed sacks. But it's the only thing we have left to invest. He had laid it out for them. His wild, desperate idea, born in the pre-dawn quiet as he watched his neighbors in the creek bed. They couldn't fight the drought. They couldn't print money. But they were no longer a collection of isolated, desperate men. They were a community again. The bank sees us as individual liabilities, Elias explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Miller, your account number 734. Marcus, you're 812. I'm 655. We're just lines on a spreadsheet, EA. SY to delete one by one. He walked to the center of the dusty circle they had formed. But what if we're not just numbers? What if we are Oakhaven? What if we go to them, not as individual debtors, but as a town? We pool what little we have. We create a single proposal, a plan for deferment, for restructuring, for all of us. One account, one community. They might be able to foreclose on a farm, but can they foreclose on a town? David Miller, a man whose spirit had been scoured out of him with the loss of his own farm, looked up, a flicker of something in his hollowed-out eyes. They'd laugh us out of the building. Let them, Elias shot back. Let them laugh. What have we got to lose that we aren't already losing? For a year, we've been waiting. Waiting for rain. Waiting for help. Waiting for the end. I'm done waiting. He looked from face to face, seeing his own fear and exhaustion reflected back at him. Last night, we went down to that creek bed, and we did the most foolish, illogical thing a group of farmers could do. We planted a flower in a desert. And this morning, not a single one of us regrets it. This morning, we all stood there together. Marcus Thorne ran a hand over his grizzled jaw. He was a man who believed in fences, deeds, and rainfall totals. He did not believe in airy notions of community spirit, but he had been there last night. He had felt the shift. He had seen the look on Elias's face when he knelt in the dirt. It's a fool's errand, Marcus grumbled, the words a familiar refrain. But the conviction was gone. It was the ghost of an argument. He looked at Elias, a long, appraising look. But, he added, so quietly they had to lean in to hear him. My father always said it's better to be a fool in good company than a wise man alone. He sighed. A great, gusting sound like a tired bull. All right, Walker. I'm in. God help us all. A murmur of assent went through the small group. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of men who had been drowning deciding to link arms and kick for the surface together. It was at that precise moment, as this fragile coalition was formed, that Ben Carter's car pulled up the drive, trailing a plume of dust like a reluctant comet. The meeting broke up, the men dispersing with nods and grim, determined expressions, leaving Elias alone to face the newcomer. Elias Walker? Ben asked, getting out of his car and holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. Who's asking? Elias's tone was guarded. The fragile hope he'd been nurturing felt like a small flame he had to shield from the wind of the outside world. My name is Ben Carter. I'm a reporter. Elias's posture stiffened. We've got nothing to say to reporters. The story's been written a dozen times. Drought devastates rural community. Farmers face ruin. We know the headline. I think the headline's changed, Ben said. He walked closer, taking the camera from his shoulder. He didn't show Elias the picture of Leo this time. He showed him a different one. A wide shot, taken from the highway, of the creek bed filled with dozens of small, flickering lights, a fallen constellation of people. I was there last night, Ben said quietly. Up on the highway. I saw what you did. I don't think this is a story about dying anymore. I think it's a story about what people do when they refuse to die. I want to tell that story. Elias stared at the image. He saw his town, his neighbors, his family, captured from a distance. He saw them not as he had experienced them, a collection of individual fears and hopes, but as the world would see them, a unified, inexplicable, and powerful whole. He saw the truth in the journalist's words. The story had changed. He was no longer just the protagonist of his own tragedy. He was a character in a much larger, stranger narrative. He finally met Ben's eyes. "All right," he said, the word heavy with a year of unspoken grief and a single night of reclaimed hope. "Come inside. I'll put the coffee on." They were sitting at the worn kitchen table, the same table where Elias and Anya had held hands just hours before, when the second car arrived. This one was different. It was a late-model black sedan, clean despite the dust, its city gloss an insult to the parched landscape. It moved up the drive with a quiet, predatory confidence. Elias saw it through the kitchen window, and a cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. This was not a reporter. This was not a neighbor. This was the world he had been trying to rally against, arriving on his doorstep. A man in a charcoal gray suit got out. He was in his late 50s, his hair silvered at the temples, his face a mask of professional placidity. He carried a slim leather briefcase. He adjusted his tie against the wind, his movements precise and unhurried. He walked to the porch, his polished leather shoes crunching on the same gravel where Elias had stood at dawn, and knocked on the doorframe. "Elias Walker?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, devoid of any discernible emotion. Elias stood up, his body feeling heavy, the brief levity of his conversation with Ben evaporating like a puddle in the sun. "I am. My name is Arthur Henderson. I'm from the regional office of AgriBank." He did not offer to shake hands. He simply stood there, a specter of finance and foreclosure. "I believe you've been expecting us. I'm here to conduct the final property assessment." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Final assessment. It was the clinical, bloodless term for the last rites of a family farm. Ben Carter, who had stood up with Elias, felt the hair on his arms stand up. He had come for a human interest story. He had just walked into the heart of the conflict. He instinctively reached for his camera. Anya appeared from the back of the house, Leo holding onto her hand. She had heard the name, AgriBank, and her face was pale. Leo, however, saw only a visitor. He looked at the man in the strange, dark clothes with a child's simple curiosity. "Hello," Leo said, his small voice cutting through the tension. "Are you here to see our flower?" Henderson's professional mask twitched for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the boy, a slight frown creasing his brow. "I'm sorry, son. I'm here on business with your father." "But our flower is very important business," Leo insisted, with the unimpeachable logic of a 6-year-old. Elias put a hand on Leo's shoulder. He looked at Henderson, at the neat suit, the polished shoes, the briefcase full of documents that held the power to turn his life, his father's life, and his son's future into a column of negative numbers. A year ago, this man's arrival would have broken him. He would have been filled with a helpless, seething rage. But today was different. He was not just Elias Walker, account number 655. He was the man who had dug in the sacred earth with his bare hands. He was the man who had forged a desperate alliance in his barn. "My son is GHD, Mr. Henderson," Elias said, his voice quiet but steady. "The flower is very important business. It's the most important business this town has done in a year. Why don't you come and see it?" It was not a request. It was a challenge. Before Henderson could formulate a response based on protocol and procedure, Elias was leading the way, his family beside him. Ben Carter followed, his camera held low, its shutter clicking almost silently. Henderson, after a moment of stunned hesitation, found himself following as well, a man of spreadsheets and air-conditioned offices being led into the dust by a defiant farmer. Word had spread. The sight of the black car at the Walker farm was an alarm bell that every person in Oakhaven could hear. As Elias's small procession crossed the fallow field towards the creek, others began to emerge. Marcus Thorne appeared from his property, a heavy wrench still in his hand. The Millers walked up from the road. Alara closed the general store and began the long walk, wiping her hands on her apron. They fell in behind, a silent, growing crowd, their footsteps on the dry earth a soft, rhythmic drumming. When they reached the embankment, Henderson stopped, his polished shoes at the edge of the crumbling dirt. He looked down into the creek bed, at the single, small sunflower, and then at the 50 or 60 people who were now standing on the banks or down in the hollow, all of them watching him. Their faces were not hostile. They were not threatening. They were simply watching, their expressions a mixture of grim resolve and that same fragile, unnerving hope. "Mr. Walker," Henderson began, his voice straining to maintain its professional calm. "This is highly irregular. My assessment is of the farm's physical assets, its viability." "Then assess this," Elias said, gesturing not to the flower, but to the people. "These are my assets. This is our viability." He stooped down and scooped up a handful of the dry, gray soil from the creek bed. He held it out to Henderson on his open palm. "You see this is worthless. A liability. You see a zero. I see my grandfather's sweat. I see my father's hands. I see the place where my son said a prayer. Your bank talks about investment. Well, we are invested, Mr. Henderson. We are invested with our lives, our blood, our memories. What's your collateral against that?" Henderson was speechless. He was a man trained to deal with numbers, with legal arguments, with angry but ultimately powerless individuals. He had no training for this. He was not being threatened. He was being confronted with a reality that did not fit into any of the columns on his forms. He was a creature of logic and order, and he had been led into the heart of a myth. The wind swirled around them, lifting dust from the creek bed, making the petals on the solitary sunflower tremble. It was a long, silent moment, the only sound that of the wind and the quiet, rhythmic clicks of Ben Carter's camera. The journalist knew he was capturing more than just a confrontation. He was capturing the soul of a place, the precise moment when despair turned into defiance. Finally, Henderson took a small step back, away from the edge. I will file my report," he stammered, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. He turned and walked, almost fled, back through the silent crowd, which parted to let him pass. He got into his clean, black car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that the wind quickly tore apart and scattered. No one cheered. The victory, if it was won, was too tenuous, the future too uncertain. But as the car disappeared, a collective breath was released. They had not won, but they had not lost. They had stood their ground, on a piece of dead earth, and they had not been moved. Elias let the dust sift through his fingers, returning it to the ground. Anya came and stood beside him, sliding her hand into his. Leo looked up at them, his face serene. He did not understand the complexities of debt and foreclosure, but he understood the simple truth of what had just happened. A man had come to cause them harm, and he had left. Their home was, for now, still their home. As the sun began to dip towards the bruised horizon, casting the creek bed in a warm, golden light, the villagers began to make their way back to their own homes, a quiet murmur of conversation replacing the tense silence. Ben Carter lowered his camera, his heart pounding. This isn't a story about a drought anymore, he thought, the full weight of it landing on him. It's a story about a resurrection. Elias stayed with his family, watching the light fade. The wind, their constant companion all day, seemed to soften, its voice changing from a sigh to a whisper. And it carried with it something new, a scent, so faint, so alien, that at first he thought he was imagining it. It was a cool, clean smell. A green smell. Anya lifted her head, her eyes wide. "Elias, do you smell that?" He breathed in deep, trying to isolate it from the familiar sense of dust and dry vegetation. And then he had it. It was the smell of damp earth, of ozone, of life-giving water kissing a thirsty world. It was the scent of petrichor, the smell of rain. He looked up. The sky was still painfully, heartbreakingly clear, a vast, star-dusted canvas of deepening blue. There were no clouds, not a single one. But the wind knew. The earth remembered. And for the first time in over a year, the air above Oakhaven, carried on a wind from a place they could not see, smelled of a promise that was on its way to being kept. Chapter 4. The Weight of Water. The scent of rain was a ghost. It haunted the air for an hour after the banker's black sedan had vanished, a phantom presence that rewrote the very nature of the wind. It was no longer just a dry, dusty breath. Now it carried a rumor, a memory of moisture from some distant, luckier land. The people of Oakhaven breathed it in like a sacrament, their faces tilted up not towards the cloudless, indifferent sky, but as if listening to a whisper carried on the air. It was a promise that defied the evidence of their own eyes. The crowd by the creek bed did not disperse in a rush. They lingered, their shared act of defiance having forged a new, unspoken connection between them. They were no longer just neighbors united by geography and misfortune. They were a congregation that had witnessed a minor, potent miracle, not of a flower blooming, but of a man in a suit fleeing from the power of their collective stillness. They spoke in low tones, the wind snatching their words. They looked at Elias Walker with a new kind of awe, a fearful respect. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply held up a handful of their worthless dirt and declared it priceless. In doing so, he had given voice to a truth they all felt but had never known how to articulate. Finally, as the light bled from the sky, turning the parched hills into bruised purple silhouettes, they began to drift away. They walked back to their homes, to their mounting bills and empty larders, but they walked differently. Their shoulders were a little squarer, their steps a little less weary. They had faced the beast, and it had blinked. For the first time in a year, the future felt less like a cliff edge and more like an uncharted road. Elias remained with Anya and Leo until they were alone, the twilight wrapping around them like a cool blanket. The scent of rain had faded, leaving behind the familiar, honest smell of dust. The ghost had departed. Did he go away forever? Leo asked, his voice small in the vast quiet of the creek bed. He was looking at the sunflower, which stood in the gathering dark like a lone, faithful sentinel. Elias knelt, putting his hands on his son's small shoulders. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to give his son that simple, absolute certainty. But he had learned the hard way that the world did not deal in absolutes, only in deferments. He went away for today, Leo, he said, his voice rough with a truth he wished he could sand down. And that's enough. Today, we were strong enough. Anya's hand found his. Her fingers were cool and steady, an anchor in the swirling currents of his own exhaustion and fragile elation. You were, Elias, she said softly, her gaze fixed on his face, seeing past the grime and the weariness to the man who had stood his ground. You gave them something to hold on to. I gave them words, Anya. Just words. Words are seeds, she countered, her voice firm. You planted something today. Not just in the dirt. In them. She squeezed his hand. Now we have to pray it grows. He looked from his wife to his son, to the dying flower that refused to die, and felt the immense, terrifying weight of what he had started. Hope, he was discovering, was far heavier than despair. Despair was a passive state, a drowning. Hope was an active struggle, the exhausting, desperate kicking towards a surface you could not even see. He had pulled them all into the struggle with him. He had made them kick. Now, he was responsible for finding the surface. In a sterile motel room 40 miles away, the only scent was that of industrial-grade cleaner and stale air conditioning. Ben Carter sat on the edge of a stiff bed, the glow from his laptop screen illuminating his face. On the screen, a grid of photographs, thumbnails of a miracle. There was Leo, his face angelic in the candlelight, his hand a blessing on the earth. There was the wide shot from the highway, the creek bed a galaxy of fallen stars. There were the faces of the farmers in the barn, Marcus Thorne's skeptical scowl, David Miller's hollowed-out grief. And then there were the images from today. He clicked on one, and it filled the screen. Elias, his hand outstretched, offering a palmful of dust to the suited banker. In the background, the silent, watching faces of the town, their expressions unreadable but their presence an undeniable force. The composition was perfect, a tableau of two worlds colliding, the organic, earthen defiance against the rigid, tailored power of capital. It was the kind of photograph that won awards. It was the kind of photograph that could define a career. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen read, "Frank, editor." He took a deep breath and answered. "Tell me you have something for me, Ben." The voice on the other end rasped, a sound lubricated by decades of coffee and cigarettes. Frank Dempsey didn't do pleasantries. "I have it, Frank," Ben said, his eyes still locked on the image of Elias. "But it's not the story we thought it was." "Good. Misery is a dime a dozen. What's the angle?" Local farmer snaps, holds off the bank with a shotgun. Cult forms around a magic beanstalk. "Nothing that simple," Ben said. He tried to explain. He told Frank about the ceremony in the creek, the wind, the banker's visit, the collective act of passive resistance. He spoke of the scent of rain on a cloudless day. As he spoke, he could feel the story's strange power losing its shape, becoming thin and unbelievable when translated into the cynical vernacular of the newsroom. There was a long silence on the other end. "So, let me get this straight," Frank finally said, his voice dripping with condescension. "A bunch of broke farmers stood around a flower, and it scared a debt collector away. And you think that's a story? Ben, I sent you for a tragedy, not a fairy tale. We need conflict. We need stakes. Where's the foreclosure notice? Where's the auction? Where's the heartbreaking photo of the little girl crying as they take her pony away? The foreclosure is coming, Frank. That's the point." Ben's voice rose, frustration coiling in his gut. "This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. They're fighting back. Not with guns, but with faith. With community. It's a story about hope." Another pause. Ben could almost hear Frank rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Hope doesn't sell papers, Ben. Desperation does. Look, the story is the bank versus the farmer. Henderson, this banker, he's the villain. The Walkers are the victims. Frame it that way. Get the shot of the eviction notice nailed to the door. That's your money shot. Run with that, and you're on the front page." "If I do that," Ben said slowly, the implications solidifying in his mind, "I make them a spectacle. I turn them into a national sob story. It'll bring 100 other reporters here like vultures, and it'll paint a target on their backs. The bank will have to crush them just to save face." "That's not your problem," Frank said, his voice hard. "Your problem is filing a story that people will read. Give me the conflict, Ben, or I'll send someone who can." The line went dead. Ben stared at the phone, then back at the photograph on his screen. Frank was right, from a certain point of view. The story was there, easy and brutal. Villain, victim, conflict. He could write it in his sleep. It would be powerful, and it would be a lie. Or rather, it would be a single, shallow truth that betrayed the deeper, more complicated one. The truth he had seen in Elias Walker's eyes. The truth that had nothing to do with being a victim. He closed the laptop. He had come to Oakhaven to be a storyteller, but he had been handed a choice. He could be a stenographer for a tragedy, or he could try to be a translator for a myth. The first path led to the front page. The second, he had no idea where the second path led. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark, empty highway. For the first time in his career, he was more afraid of writing the wrong story than of writing no story at all. The sun rose the next morning on a different Oakhaven. The air was electric with purpose. The fragile hope from the night before had survived the dark and calcified into resolve. There was a plan. It was a desperate, flimsy thing, But it was a plan. They met in Elias's BA.RN again. The same group as before, but with a few new faces drawn in by the stories that had rippled through the valley overnight. The wind still blew through the open doors, but no one was listening to it anymore. They were listening to Elias. Henderson will file his report today. Elias began, his voice flat and practical. He stood beside a workbench, his hands resting on the worn wood. He'll tell them what happened. Maybe he'll describe it as a protest, maybe as a threat. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the men he works for, the men in the glass towers in the capital, they don't deal in soil and sunflowers. They deal in numbers. And our numbers are all in the red. Marcus Thorne grunted his agreement. They'll send the marshals next time. Not a man in a suit. Exactly, Elias said, meeting Marcus's gaze. So we can't wait for them to come to us. We have to go to them. A nervous silence fell over the group. The capital was another world, a place of concrete and noise and men like Henderson, only more powerful and less patient. We go to the Agri-Bank headquarters, Elias continued, laying out the idea that had taken shape in his mind during a sleepless night. Not to beg, not to protest on their doorstep. We go as a delegation. We walk in the front door, and we ask for a meeting. We present them with our proposal, the one we talked about yesterday. Not as a collection of failing accounts, but as the Oakhaven Valley Cooperative. We show them we're not a liability to be written off. We're an asset to be invested in. David Miller, who had been sitting silently on a hay bale, his face a mask of weary resignation, spoke for the first time. They'll never let us in the door, Elias. We're farmers, not businessmen. We're both, Elias countered, his voice sharp. We've just forgotten how to be the second one. We've been so busy trying to survive day to day that we've forgotten how to plan for the year. This is us planning for the year. He looked around the barn, at the faces of his friends and neighbors. I'll go. I have to. But I can't go alone. I'll need one other person. He didn't need to ask for volunteers. He looked directly at Marcus. He was the most respected, the most pragmatic, the rock of the community. But Marcus shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. My place is here, Elias, he said, his voice gravelly. Someone has to stay. Someone has to keep this lot from turning on each other if you're not back in a week. Someone has to make sure the wells don't run dry. It was not an excuse. It was a statement of fact, an acceptance of a different, but equally vital, role. Elias nodded, understanding. Then his eyes fell on David Miller. David, who had lost his farm 6 months ago. David, who had been living on the charity of his wife's sister in the next town and had only returned for the whisper of the ceremony. He was the ghost of their collective future, the living embodiment of what they were all fighting against. David, Elias said, his voice gentle. David looked up, startled. Me? What good can I do? I'm the one who failed. The words were raw, a confession whispered in the dusty air. No, Elias said, walking over to him. You're the one who knows what we stand to lose. You're not a failure, David. You're a warning. And you're proof. When we walk into that office, they're going to see you and me. The man who's about to lose his farm, and the man who already has. We are their worst-case scenario and their last chance, all in one room. They need to see both. A flicker of something long dead rekindled in David Miller's eyes. For months, he had been an object of pity, a cautionary tale. Elias had just turned his greatest shame into his greatest strength. He slowly, shakily, got to his feet. Okay, Elias, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent barn. Okay, I'll go. 300 miles away, in a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Agri-Bank Tower, Arthur Henderson was drowning in refrigerated air. The view from his window was a stunning panorama of the city, a geometric forest of glass and steel that stretched to the horizon. There was no dust here, no wind, just the silent, omnipresent hum of the building's climate control system. He had been staring at the blank report template on his monitor for an hour. Asterisk property assessment, Walker Farm, Oakhaven. Account hashtag 655. Asterisk under asset viability. His cursor blinked, mocking him. How could he quantify what he had seen? Asterisk, farm shows signs of extreme drought stress. Soil quality poor. Primary residence in need of significant repair. However, owner has cultivated what appears to be a quasi-religious following centered on a single, moribund sunflower. Community exhibits signs of collective delusion, rendering standard foreclosure protocols potentially problematic. Asterisk. He deleted the words, disgusted with himself. He sounded like an anthropologist, not a risk analyst. He picked up his phone and dialed a 4-digit extension. Reynolds. The voice was clipped, impatient. Sir, it's Arthur Henderson. Regarding the Oak Haven assessments. Arthur, said Vice President Reynolds. I expected your report an hour ago. Is there a problem? There are unusual circumstances, sir. The community is organized. There was a confrontation yesterday. Nonviolent, but highly orchestrated. It would not be an exaggeration to say they have been radicalized by their situation. Reynolds sighed, a sound of pure, weaponized boredom. Arthur, are you telling me you were intimidated by a group of farmers? I have our regional council on standby. We've dealt with organized protests before. A court order and a pair of county sheriffs usually dissolve this kind of radicalization quite effectively. It's not like that, sir. It's more symbolic. It's difficult to explain. The optics would be very poor. Optics? Reynolds' voice turned to ice. Let me explain our reality. Arthur, since you seem to be having trouble with it. The Viridia Valley portfolio represents a $17 million loss on our books this quarter. $17 million. I am not concerned with the optics of a single $500,000 foreclosure. I am concerned with my fiduciary duty to our shareholders. You are there to assess assets, not to conduct a sociological study. Yes, sir, but your report is due on my desk by end of business. I want a clear recommendation for immediate foreclosure proceedings. If you feel you are unable to provide that, I can find someone who is. Is that understood? Yes, Mr. Reynolds, Henderson said, his own voice sounding hollow in the sterile office. Understood. He hung up the phone. He looked out the window again, at the city that ran on numbers and logic. He thought of the farmer's hand, filled with dirt. He thought of the silent, watching faces. They were not a number. They were a place. And he had been ordered to sign the document that would erase it from the map. He turned back to his keyboard and began to type. Anya packed a small, worn canvas bag for Elias. 2 shirts, a block of cheese, a loaf of bread she had baked yesterday, and the last of their good coffee in a thermos. Her movements were calm and efficient, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her own heart. She had stood by him in the creek bed, a silent pillar of support, but here, in the quiet of their home, the fear was a physical presence. You don't have to do this, she said, not looking at him as she folded a shirt with meticulous care. We could leave. We still have the truck. We could go somewhere else. Start over. The words tasted like treason, but she had to say them. Elias came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He breathed in the scent of her hair, a familiar comfort in a world that had become terrifyingly strange. And go where, Anya? He asked gently. To another farm that's drying up? To a city where we don't know a soul? To work a job that kills you slowly instead of quickly? This is our home. My father is buried in that soil. Your mother's roses are still trying to grow by the porch. Leo took his first steps in that yard. If we run from this, we're not just leaving a piece of land. We're leaving ourselves. She leaned back against him, her body trembling slightly. I'm scared, Elias. I know, he whispered into her hair. I'm terrified, but I'm more scared of what happens if we do nothing. I'm more scared of the man I'd become if I let them take this without a fight. She turned in his arms and looked at him, her clear eyes searching his. Then you fight, she said, her voice regaining its strength. You go there and you tell them. You make them see. A crunch of tires on the gravel outside interrupted them. Elias looked out the window. It was Ben Carter. But behind his rental car, another vehicle was pulling up, and then another. It was Marcus Thorne's truck. The Miller's station wagon. Old Man Hemlock was in the passenger seat of Alara's sedan. Elias and Anya went out onto the porch. One by one, the people of Oakhaven were getting out of their cars and walking towards the farmhouse. They weren't coming for a meeting. They were coming for a departure. Alara was the first to approach, wiping her hands on her apron. She carried a large paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and apples. "For the road," she said, pressing it into Anya's hands. No man should fight a dragon on an empty stomach. Marcus Thorne came next. He didn't say a word. He just pushed a thick, crumpled envelope into Elias's hand. Elias opened it. Inside was a chaotic collection of bills, 5s, 10s, a few 20s. Over $200. "It's not much," Marcus grumbled, refusing to meet his eye. "It's the emergency fund for the co-op, gas money. A clean motel room. Don't come back saying you had to sleep in the truck." David Miller's wife, Sarah, came forward and gave her husband a fierce, desperate hug. "You show them, David," she whispered. "You show them what they did." Old Man Hemlock, leaning heavily on a cane, shuffled up to Elias. He held out a thin, folded road atlas, its creases worn soft with 100 journeys. "My father used this," he said, his voice a reedy whisper. "It's never led a Hemlock astray. Don't you trust those newfangled GPS machines? They ain't got no soul." One by one they came, with offerings small and profound. A bag of jerky, a spare tire, a blessing, a handshake. It was a slow, sacred procession of hope. They were entrusting him not just with their futures, but with their last, pooled resources. The weight of it was immense, a physical pressure on his chest. Ben Carter stood back, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. He was witnessing the very thing he'd been unable to explain to his editor. This wasn't a story of victims. This was a community anointing its champions. This was the story, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not be filing Frank's version. He would tell this one, or none at all. Finally, it was time. Elias hugged Leo, holding his small, warm body tight against his chest. "You be good for your mom," he said, his voice thick. "And you keep an eye on our flower." "I will, Daddy," Leo said, his face serious. "You go be brave." Elias kissed Anya, a long, deep kiss that said everything they didn't have the words for. It was a promise of return, a prayer against the unknown, a desperate clinging in the face of the storm. He and David Miller climbed into the cab of his old Ford pickup. The engine turned over with a protesting groan, then settled into a familiar, rumbling idle. The truck was caked in a year's worth of the very dust they were fighting for. It was an ark of Oakhaven, setting out on an impossible voyage. Elias put the truck in gear and started down the long drive. The people stood watching, not waving, just standing, a silent testament to the faith they had placed in the two men in the dusty cab. He looked in the rearview mirror, at his wife and son standing on the porch, at the faces of his neighbors, at the skeletal oak that guarded his home. He kept driving until they were just small figures in a vast, parched landscape. Then he looked up, through the bug-spattered windshield, at the sky ahead. It was a brilliant, searing, impossible blue. A perfect, beautiful, damning expanse of emptiness. There were still no clouds. The scent of rain was gone, replaced by the smell of gasoline and hot metal. The ghost of a promise had vanished, and all that was left was the road ahead, and the crushing, terrible weight of water that had not yet fallen. Chapter 5. The Geometry of Power. The journey was measured in silence. The old Ford pickup truck, a vessel of rust and memory, moved through the landscape like a prayer bead being pushed along a string. For the first hour, the world outside the windows was their own. The parched, cracked earth of Oakhaven gave way to the slightly less desperate, but still thirsty, lands of the neighboring valleys. The hills were the color of a sleeping lion, a palette of ochre, tan, and sun-bleached gold. The sky remained a vast, unforgiving canvas of blue. Inside the cab, the air was thick with the smells of dust, old vinyl, and the faint, sweet scent of Alara's apple bread, a ghost of the home they had left behind. Elias drove with a farmer's economy of motion, his large, calloused hands resting lightly on the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for a change in the weather that he knew would not come. David Miller sat in the passenger seat, a man folded into himself. He was a portrait of absence. His hands lay limp in his lap, his gaze fixed on the fractured landscape rushing past. He had not spoken since they had cleared the county line. The silence between them wasn't hostile, nor was it comfortable. It was heavy hard space filled with the unsaid weight of everything they were driving towards, and everything they had already lost. David was the embodiment of that loss, and his presence in the truck was a constant, grim reminder of the stakes. Elias knew he had to break it. He had chosen David not for his strength, but for his truth. But a truth that remained silent was just a wound. To be a weapon, it had to be spoken. "How's Sarah holding up?" Elias asked, his voice a low rumble against the engine's drone. David flinched, as if startled from a dream. He turned to look at Elias, his eyes clouded with a familiar shame. She's strong. Stronger than me. She works a double shift at the diner in Preston twice a week. Her sister helps with the kids. They get by." He paused, his throat working. "They get by without me." "That's not true and you know it," Elias said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're just in a different part of the fight right now." David gave a short, bitter laugh that was more like a cough. "What fight? Shingling my brother-in-law's roof for $20? I'm not a farmer anymore, Elias. I don't know what I am." "You're a man who knows the value of the dirt under his fingernails," Elias said, glancing over at him. "That's more than the men we're going to see will ever know." David fell silent again, but something had shifted. The silence was less of a void now, more of a contemplation. He reached for the old, worn atlas that old man Hemlock had given them. He opened it across his lap, its pages as soft and fragile as ancient cloth. He traced the blue line of a river that, on the map, was still bold and alive, not the pathetic, dusty scar it had become in reality. "My dad," David began, his voice barely a whisper, "he used to say you could read a map like a story. The green parts were the good times, the fat years. The brown parts were the struggles. The blue lines were the promises. The promises that things could always grow again." He looked out the window at the brown, brittle landscape. "The promises are all broken, Elias." "No," Elias said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "The promises are still there. They're just buried. We're going to go dig them up." They drove on. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape began to change. The gentle roll of the hills flattened. The organic curves of the land were slowly, then abruptly, replaced by the rigid lines of human ambition. First came the sprawling suburbs, their identical houses arranged in neat, sterile rows, their lawns a chemically induced, desperate green. Then the highways widened, multiplying into great concrete rivers of rushing steel. The world had become a thing of sharp edges and hard surfaces, a geometry of power that felt alien and hostile. The city rose from the haze of the horizon not as a single entity, but as a jagged mountain range of glass and steel. It was a monument to a different kind of God, one who traded in concrete and capital, not sun and soil. Elias felt the old truck, his ark of dust and hope, shrink with every mile they drew closer, becoming a small, fragile thing in a world of giants. He looked over at David, who was staring up at the approaching skyline, his face pale. The warning Elias had spoken of in the barn was now a living, breathing man, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the forces that had crushed him. Elias knew in that moment that the first part of his battle was not in the gleaming tower ahead, but here, in the dusty cab of his truck. He had to help David remember how to stand before he could ask him to stand with him. Back in Oakhaven, the sun beat down with a personal malevolence. The air was a physical weight, thick and stagnant. Hope had departed in a dusty pickup truck, and in its place, a tense, watchful quiet had settled over the valley. Anya stood by the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, but her gaze was fixed on the driveway, on the empty space where the truck should have been. Every nerve in her body was stretched taut, a wire humming with a single, silent question. Are they there yet? Leo sat at the kitchen table, pushing a small wooden tractor through a puddle of spilled milk, making quiet engine noises. He was the anchor that kept her from floating away on the sea of her own anxiety. For him, she had to maintain the fiction that this was just another day. Another day of heat, another day of waiting. "Mama," he said, looking up at her, his face serious. "Is the flower thirsty?" Anya dried her hands and looked out the window at the lone sentinel in the creek bed. From this distance, it looked even more fragile, its heavy head bowed as if in prayer or exhaustion. She thought of the promise Elias had made to Leo to keep an eye on it. It was more than a flower now. It was a symbol, a focal point for the entire valley's fragile faith. It was their flag, planted in enemy territory. "Yes, sweetie," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I think it is." The well pump had been making a sick, grinding noise for a week. Every bucket of water they drew was an act of faith, a gamble against the day it would cough, sputter, and bring up nothing but sand. They had just enough in the cistern for drinking and cooking, with a little left for the precious tomato plants clinging to life in her kitchen garden. There was nothing to spare for a dying flower. But the question hung in the air. If they let the sunflower die, what were they saying about their own hope? If they couldn't keep this one small, symbolic thing alive, how could they expect Elias to succeed in a city of stone? As if summoned by her thoughts, she saw a figure walking slowly down the long driveway. It was Alara, a basket hooked over one arm, her face set in a look of calm determination. A few minutes later, Sarah Miller appeared from the direction of the main road, walking with her 2 young daughters. Then came others, in 2s and 3s. The women of Oakhaven. They gathered in Anya's kitchen, a quiet congregation. There was no formal meeting, no grand pronouncements. Alara set her basket on the table. It was filled with jars of canned peaches from a better year. Sarah Miller added a bag of potatoes she'd gotten from her sister. Another woman, Mary Hemlock, brought a small sack of flour. They were pooling their resources, preparing for a siege. They were creating their own certainty in a world that offered none. "The men are fighting their battle," Alara said, her voice the calm center of the room. "We have to fight ours. The well pump on the Thorn place is sputtering," Mary said, her brow furrowed with worry. "Marcus is trying to fix it, but the part he needs has to come from the city." The unspoken fear rippled through the room. Water. It all came back to water. Anya looked at the faces around her, tired, worried, but resolute. These were the women who had held this valley together for generations, through drought, HTS and floods, good years and bad. She felt a surge of strength that had nothing to do with Elias, and everything to do with them. Leo asked if the sunflower was thirsty. Anya said, her voice clear and steady. The women all turned to look at her. "We don't have much water to spare." For a moment, no one spoke. They all understood the impossible calculus. To water the flower was an act of profound, perhaps foolish, faith. To let it die was a surrender. It was Sarah Miller who answered, her voice trembling but firm. She was the wife of the man who had already lost everything. "My David is in the city, fighting for a memory. That flower is for the future." She walked to Anya's sink, picked up the small bucket they used for the garden, and looked at Anya. "How much can we spare?" Anya looked at the faces of her neighbors. She saw her own fear reflected there, but also her own resolve. "A little," she said. "We can all spare a little." They went out together, a small procession walking from the farmhouse to the creek bed under the oppressive eye of the sun. Anya carried the bucket, containing a few precious inches of water. It felt heavier than any bucket she had ever carried. It was the weight of their collective sacrifice, a tiny offering against an enormous thirst. They gathered around the sunflower. Up close, it was a miracle of endurance. Its stem was scarred and fibrous, its leaves curled and brown at the edges, but the great, heavy head was still aimed at the sky, a crown of faded gold. Leo reached out a small hand and gently touched a wilting petal. Anya knelt. With all the women of Oakhaven watching, she slowly, carefully, poured the water onto the cracked earth at the base of the stem. The dark circle of moisture spread for a moment, a fleeting stain on the pale dirt, and then the thirsty ground drank it in, leaving no trace. It was gone, a tiny, desperate prayer, swallowed by the immense, indifferent earth. They had done what they could. Now, all they could do was wait. In the sterile chill of Motel 6, room 214, Ben Carter was at war with a blank page. The cursor on his laptop screen blinked with the methodical, infuriating rhythm of a leaky faucet. Asterisk blink. 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 Asterisk each pulse was a mockery of his indecision. Frank's voice echoed in his head, a gravelly ghost of professional cynicism. Asterisk villain, victim, conflict. That's your money shot. Asterisk it was so easy. He could write it in his sleep. He had written it a dozen times before, from 100 different dying towns. His fingers moved to the keyboard, almost of their own accord, typing out the familiar, brutal narrative. Asterisk Oakhaven, VA, in a scene playing out across the heartland. Another family farm is on the brink of extinction. Elias Walker, a third-generation farmer, faces foreclosure from the monolithic Agribank Corporation after a year-long drought has decimated his crops and his savings. Walker, along with his desperate neighbors, has been reduced to holding prayer vigils around a dying sunflower in a last-ditch, quasi-religious plea for salvation. Yesterday, they confronted a bank representative in a tense standoff, but with the full weight of the financial institution bearing down on them. Their faith seems a poor shield against the harsh realities of modern agriculture. The Walker family stands as a tragic symbol of a vanishing way of life, their future as barren as their fields. Asterisk. He stopped, reading the words on the screen. It was good. It was punchy. It was exactly what Frank wanted. It hit all the right notes: tragedy, pathos, a clear villain, a helpless victim. It was also a profound and despicable lie. It stripped Elias of his dignity, turning his quiet strength into desperation. It twisted the community's act of solidarity into a quasi-religious plea. It painted them as passive symbols, tragic victims waiting for the final blow. It missed the entire point. It missed the defiance in Elias's eyes, the fierce hope in Anya's, the communal anointing that had taken place in the driveway as the two men left. It missed the story of people refusing to be victims. He highlighted the entire paragraph and, with a satisfying click, deleted it. The blank page returned, clean and expectant. He closed his eyes, and the images flooded back. Not the images he had been trained to look for. The tears, the poverty porn, the money shot of the eviction notice. He saw the other things. He saw the flicker of candlelight on Leo's face. He saw the way the wind had stirred the dust in the barn, a living presence in the room. He saw the silent, unshakable wall of humanity standing behind Elias in the creek bed. He saw the crumpled envelope of cash Marcus Thorne had pressed into Elias's hand. He saw the women gathered on the porch, their faces etched with fear but also with a defiant strength. These were not victims. They were fighters, armed with the strangest and most ancient of weapons: soil, faith, and each other. His phone buzzed. Frank, editor. He ignored it. He began to type again, slowly this time, feeling for the truth of the words, not just their commercial value. Asterisk, there is a silence in Oakhaven Valley that is older than any bank. It's the silence of rock and heat and endless sky. For the past year, it has been a silence of despair. But now, something else is growing here, something that requires no rain. It is a quiet and stubborn refusal to break. It is the story of Elias Walker, a farmer who looked a corporation in the eye and offered it a handful of worthless dirt as if it were a treasure. It is the story of a community that has decided that faith in each other is a more valuable asset than anything listed on a balance sheet. This is not a story about the end of the American farm. It is a story about what happens when people who have lost everything decide they still have something worth fighting for. And their fight has just begun. Asterisk. He stopped. It wasn't an article yet. It was a mission statement. It was a choice. The phone buzzed again, insistent. This time, he answered it. "Did you go deaf, Ben?" Frank barked. No preamble. "I've been calling for an hour. Where's my copy?" "It's not ready," Ben said, his voice calm. "What do you mean, not ready?" "I gave you the angle on a silver platter. Bank versus farmer. Simple. Powerful. Are you writing it or not?" Ben looked at the words on his screen, the ones that felt true. "No, Frank. I'm not writing that story." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Frank Dempsey was not a man who was often told no. "What did you say?" "That's not the story, Frank. The story isn't about victims. It's about strength. It's about dignity. I won't turn these people into a spectacle for your front page." Frank's voice dropped, turning cold and sharp as chipped ice. "Let me be very clear, Ben. You have two options. You file the story I asked for in the next 30 minutes, or you can start cleaning out your desk. You're a photographer, not a poet laureate. Your job is to capture reality, not to protect your subject's delicate feelings." Ben thought of Elias's truck, the dusty Ark, heading toward the city. He thought of his own journey here, looking for a tragedy to exploit. He had found something else instead. He had found a story that might just be worth his career. "The reality," Ben said slowly, "is that you're wrong about the story. And if you can't see that, then maybe I am in the wrong business." He hung up the phone before Frank could reply. The silence in the motel room was absolute. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating lightness. He had just torched his own career. He had stepped off a cliff without knowing if there was anything below. But for the first time in a long time, the blinking cursor on the page no longer felt like a judgment. It felt like an invitation. The Agribank Tower was a shard of smoked glass thrust into the heart of the sky. It did not reflect the clouds. It seemed to repel them, a monument of polished, indifferent power. It was designed to make a man feel small, and as Elias Walker and David Miller stood before it, it was succeeding. Their truck was parked 3 blocks away, a dusty, provincial anomaly amongst the gleaming sedans and black SUVs. The walk to the tower had been a journey through another country. The sounds were different, a symphony of sirens, horns, and the incessant murmur of 1,000 conversations. The smells were different, exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, the faint aroma of street vendor hot dogs. The people were different. They moved with a sharp, angular urgency, their eyes fixed ahead, their faces closed. No one made eye contact. No one seemed to notice the 2 dusty men who looked as though they had just stepped out of a photograph from another century. They pushed through the revolving glass doors and entered the lobby. The change was instantaneous and profound. The chaotic energy of the street vanished, replaced by a cathedral-like silence, broken only by the soft, funereal chime of an elevator and the hushed whisper of conditioned air. The floor was a vast expanse of polished black marble that reflected their worn work boots, as if they were standing on a frozen lake. The air smelled of nothing, a sterile, refrigerated void. High above, a digital ticker tape streamed an endless, incomprehensible litany of numbers and symbols across a wall. They were in a place where the world had been rendered down to data. Their farms, their lives, their desperation. Here, it was all just a series of numbers on a screen. A woman sat behind a sweeping, crescent-shaped desk of dark wood and chrome. She was immaculate, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her suit a crisp, dark gray. She looked up as they approached, her expression a carefully neutral mask that did not quite conceal a flicker of disapproval at their dusty clothes. Beside her stood a security guard, a large man in a uniform so perfectly pressed he looked like he was made of origami. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes missed nothing. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice as cool and polished as the marble floor. Elias stepped forward, David a half-step behind him, as if seeking shelter in his shadow. "Yes, ma'am," Elias said, his voice quiet but resonant in the cavernous space. "We're here to see Mr. Reynolds, Vice President of Asset Management." The woman's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She scanned a screen in front of her. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am." A small, thin smile touched her lips. It was not a friendly smile. "I'm afraid Mr. Reynolds doesn't see anyone without an appointment. Perhaps you could call his secretary to schedule one." It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. She was already turning her gaze back to her screen. "We've come a long way," Elias said, his voice unchanged. He did not move. He simply stood there, a solid, earthen presence in this artificial world. 300 miles. We can wait." The security guard shifted his weight, a subtle but clear signal. The woman looked back at Elias, her patience visibly thinning. "There's no point in waiting. He won't be able to see you today." It was here, at this first barrier of polite, institutional indifference, that the battle would be joined or lost. All their hope, all the pooled gas money, all the faith of their neighbors had brought them to this desk. To be turned away now would be a fatal blow. David Miller, who had been silent and shrinking, suddenly spoke. His voice was hoarse, unsteady, but it cut through the sterile air with the raw edge of truth. "My name is David Miller," he said, looking directly at the receptionist. "My farm was account number 712. You foreclosed on me 6 months ago." He gestured to Elias. "This is Elias Walker. His farm is account number 655. You're about to do the same thing to him. We're not here to ask for an appointment. We're here as a line item that decided to walk in the door. You can tell Mr. Reynolds that." The receptionist stared at him, momentarily stripped of her professional poise. She saw not just a dusty farmer, but a piece of paperwork that had come to life. The security guard took a half-step forward, but Elias placed a calming hand on David's shoulder. He looked at the woman, his gaze steady and devoid of threat. "Please," he said, the single word carrying the weight of the entire valley. "Just tell him we're here. Tell him Oakhaven has come to call." The woman hesitated, caught between protocol and the undeniable, unscripted reality of the two men standing before her. She looked from Elias's quiet resolve to David's resurrected defiance. This was not a situation covered in her training manual. With a sigh of frustration, she picked up her telephone, her manicured finger hovering over the buttons of the console. 42 floors above them, in an office where the only view was of other towers and a sliver of indifferent sky, Vice President Reynolds was initialing the final page of Arthur Henderson's report. The recommendation was clear, concise, and exactly what he had demanded. Asterisk immediate foreclosure proceedings on account number 655, Walker Farm. Asset deemed non-viable. Asterisk he was about to slide it into the outbox for the legal department when the private line on his console beeped. He pressed the button with an annoyed jab of his finger. "What is it, Cynthia?" "Sir," came the receptionist's flustered voice. "I'm sorry to disturb you. There are 2 men here in the lobby. They're asking to see you." Reynolds scowled. "I don't take unscheduled meetings. You know that. Get rid of them." "I tried, sir. They say their names are David Miller and Elias Walker. They say Oakhaven has come to call." Reynolds froze, his hand hovering over the report. Walker, the name from the file. The name of the problem that was supposed to have been neatly resolved. He stared. D at the signature line on the foreclosure recommendation. He thought of Henderson's strange, unnerved report of a radicalized community. He had dismissed it as weakness. But now, that weakness, that problem, was not 300 miles away in a dusty field. It was in his lobby. It had crossed the sterile boundary of his world. It had a name and a voice. And it was waiting. Chapter 6, An Offering of Dust. The 42nd floor was not a place. It was a state of being. Arthur Reynolds III stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, a priest in a temple of commerce. The city sprawled below him, a vast and intricate circuit board humming with the energy of a million transactions. He did not see people. He saw vectors, flows of capital, intersecting lines of influence. He could trace the path of a container ship from the distant port to the rail lines, to the trucking depots, and finally to the distribution centers that fed the sprawling suburbs. He understood this world. It was a world of elegant, predictable mathematics. A world of control. His intercom had fallen silent, but the words echoed in the refrigerated air. Oakhaven has come to call. It was an absurdity. It was like a single-line item on a spreadsheet suddenly developing a personality and demanding an audience. It was an error in the code, a disruption to the clean geometry of his world. His first instinct, the one honed over 2 decades of ruthless efficiency, was to crush the anomaly. A word to security, a brief, sterile report, and the problem would be removed from the lobby and returned to the column of red ink where it belonged. But something else, a flicker of a less disciplined impulse, stayed his hand. Henderson's report had mentioned something unusual. A community turning inward, a strange, almost cult-like devotion to a piece of dying vegetation. Henderson had framed it as the last gasp of a desperate populace, but Reynolds, a student of power in all its forms, recognized the nascent shape of something else. Not desperation, but organized narrative. And narrative, he knew, could be a dangerous and unpredictable variable. He had built his career on anticipating variables. "Cynthia," he said, his voice a calm, modulated baritone that betrayed nothing. "Send them up." A pause, thick with the receptionist's surprise. "Sir, you heard me. Send Mr. Walker and Mr. Miller to my office. And hold my calls." He clicked off the intercom and turned from the window. His office was a testament to minimalist power. A single, massive desk of brushed steel and obsidian glass. 2 sleek leather chairs for visitors, positioned to be slightly lower than his own. The walls were bare save for a single, enormous abstract painting, a chaotic splash of black on a stark white canvas that suggested a controlled explosion. There was no clutter, no family photos, no personal effects. His life was as clean and ordered as his balance sheets. He sat behind his desk, the leather of his chair sighing softly. He steepled his fingers, his manicured nails forming a perfect, symmetrical peak. Let them come. Let the dust of their dying world into his sanctuary. He would hear them out, extend a token, meaningless courtesy, and then he would execute the foreclosure. He would reassert the natural order. This was not a negotiation. It was a lesson in inevitability, and he would be the teacher. The wait in the lobby stretched into a geological age. Elias stood, still and patient as a stone, his gaze resting on the endless stream of numbers flowing across the digital ticker. He did not pretend to understand them, but he understood their purpose. They were a different kind of weather report, forecasting a climate in which men like him could no longer survive. David, by contrast, was a storm of restless energy. He sat, then stood, then paced a small, tight circle on the polished marble. Each chime of the elevator was a small shock to his system. This building, this city, was the anonymous force that had broken him. To be inside it was to be trapped in the belly of the whale that had swallowed his life. "They're not going to see us," he muttered, his voice tight with remembered humiliation. "This is just another way to say no. Make us wait until we give up and crawl away." "We're not crawling anywhere," Elias said, his voice calm, not turning from the ticker. We're here to say our piece. We'll wait as long as it takes. Say our piece? Elias, what are we going to say? That the rain didn't come? That the bank's interest rates are higher than our corn? They know. They've got it all on a computer somewhere. We're just numbers to them. 7:12 and 6:55. Elias finally turned to look at him. His eyes were clear, his expression unreadable. Then we have to give them something they can't put into a computer. Before David could ask what that meant, the immaculate receptionist looked up from her desk. The mask of professional indifference was back in place, but her eyes, when they met theirs, held a flicker of something new. Curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of fear. Mr. Reynolds will see you now, she said, her voice a little too loud in the silent lobby. She gestured toward a bank of elevators. 42nd floor. The security guard, who had been watching them with a lazy vigilance, straightened up. He escorted them to a specific elevator, one with no other buttons, and used a keycard to activate it. The doors hissed shut, encasing them in a small, sterile box of stainless steel and recessed lighting. There was a soft, almost imperceptible lurch as they began to ascend. The silence in the elevator was more profound than the silence in the truck. There was no engine drone, no rush of wind, only the faint, high hum of machinery. David stared at the numbers above the door as they lit up, one after another, climbing higher and higher. 5, 12, 21, 35. He felt a pressure building in his ears, a dizzying sense of being lifted away from everything he knew. They were leaving the ground, the solid, tangible world of dirt and rock, and rising into the abstract realm of power, a place where fortunes were made and lives were broken with the click of a mouse. He glanced at Elias. The big farmer was utterly still, his hands loose at his sides, his feet planted slightly apart, as if he were standing on the deck of a ship in a rolling sea. He was watching his own reflection in the polished steel of the door, but his gaze seemed to be looking through it, beyond it, to the horizon he knew so well. He was carrying the valley with him, a quiet, heavy ballast against the disorienting ascent. The elevator slowed with another gentle lurch, and the number 42 glowed with quiet finality. The doors opened not onto a hallway, but directly into a reception area even more opulent and silent than the lobby below. A different assistant, a man this time, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than David's first tracto. Rose from a desk. Mr. Walker? Mr. Miller? He asked, his voice a hushed murmur. Mr. Reynolds is waiting for you. This way, please. He led them across a thick gray carpet that muffled their footsteps completely. They passed walls of glass that looked out onto the city, the view absolute and dizzying. They were walking on air, suspended above the world. The assistant stopped before a pair of tall, dark wood doors and knocked once, a soft, respectful tap. Enter, a voice commanded from within. The assistant opened one of the doors and stepped aside, gesturing them in. They walked past him, into the heart of the machine. The air in Oakhaven grew heavier as the day wore on. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the tin roofs, the parched fields, the very will of the people. After the small ceremony at the creek bed, the women had dispersed, returning to their own homes, their own worries, their own dwindling supplies. The brief, powerful moment of communal action had passed, leaving behind the stark reality of their situation. Anya stood on her porch, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. The bucket they had used to water the sunflower sat empty by the steps, an accusation. The act felt foolish now, a child's wish against a hurricane. She could almost feel the sun drawing that precious moisture back out of the earth, stealing their offering before it could do any good. From inside, she heard Leo's frustrated cry. She went back into the stifling heat of the kitchen. He was standing by the sink, turning the handle of the tap back and forth. Nothing came out but a dry, asthmatic hiss. It's broken, Mama, he said, his lower lip trembling. The water is broken. Anya's heart sank. She had known it was coming. The groans and rattles from the well pump had been getting worse for days. She tried the tap herself. The hissing gave way to a shuddering cough, a hollow, percussive clank 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 from deep in the earth, and then silence. The well was dry, or the pump was dead. In the end, the distinction didn't matter. The result was the same. The cistern held a day's worth of drinking water, maybe two. After that, nothing. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the haze of heat and anxiety. It was one thing to worry about a bank, about men in suits in a city far away. That was an abstract threat. This was real. This was immediate. This was thirst. She forced a calm smile for Leo. It's okay, sweetie. It's just tired, like the flower. We'll get Daddy to look at it when he gets home. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She didn't know when Elias would be home. And even when he returned, what could he do? The parts they needed, the expertise, it all cost money they no longer had. A familiar rumble broke the stillness. Not a pickup truck, but the grumbling complaint of an old sedan. She looked out the window to see Mary Hemlock's dusty Buick pulling into the driveway. Alara was in the passenger seat. Anya went out to meet them, Leo clinging to her leg. Mary's face was grim. It's the Thorns pump, she said without preamble. It's gone. Marcus worked on it all morning, but the motor is shot. Ours, too. Anya said, her voice flat. Just now. Alara got out of the car, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of her age. She looked from Anya's face to the silent farmhouse, then out toward the creek bed. And the miller's pump went yesterday, she said. It wasn't a question. A pattern was emerging, a cruel, mechanical attrition. The wells weren't just running dry. The machinery, old and overworked, was failing. The valley's life support system was shutting down, one pump at a time. The agribank foreclosure was a guillotine hanging over their future, but the drought was a slow garrote, tightening around their present. There's the old hand pump at the community hall, Mary said, though her tone lacked conviction. It's deep. It might still have water, but it won't be enough. Not for everyone. Not for long. They stood there for a moment in the oppressive heat, 3 generations of Oakhaven women, facing a crisis as old as humanity itself. The failure of water. The end of things. It was Alara who broke the silence. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, drooping head of the sunflower. The first thing a seed does, she said, her voice soft but clear, is break. It has to break open in the dark before it can find the light. Maybe a valley is the same. Anya and Mary looked at her, then followed her gaze to the solitary flower. It seemed an impossible, fragile thing to pin any hope on. But as Anya stared, she thought of the water they had poured at its roots. An offering. A prayer. A desperate act of faith. She had thought the sun had already stolen it. But what if it hadn't? What if, deep in the dark, cracked earth, something was listening? In the stale, air-conditioned gloom of room 214, Ben Carter was a ghost haunting the scene of his own professional suicide. The silence left by Frank's angry tirade had settled into a thick, suffocating blanket. He had replayed the conversation a dozen times, each time feeling the same sickening lurch of terror followed by a defiant surge of adrenaline. He was adrift. For 15 years, his life had been defined by the next assignment, the next deadline, the next paycheck. Now, there was nothing. Just a blank screen and a story that nobody wanted him to write. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He stopped on a name, Markham, Globe-Dispatch. David Markham was an old-school editor, a man who still believed journalism was a public trust, not just a content-generating enterprise. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Ben had taken the higher-paying, lower-prestige job with Frank's wire service. It was a long shot. He dialed. Markham picked up on the 4th ring. Yeah. David? It's Ben Carter. A pause. Ben. Christ. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. I thought you were off chasing ambulance fires for the vultures. Something like that, Ben said, wincing. Listen, I quit. Good for your soul, bad for your wallet. Markham grunted. What's up? You're not calling to ask for your old job back, are you? Budgets are tighter than a gnat's ass. No. I have a story. A real one. Ben launched into it, the words tumbling out, fueled by desperation and a genuine, uncynical excitement he hadn't felt in years. He talked about Oakhaven, about the drought, about the quiet dignity of Elias Walker. He described the standoff in the creek bed, the community's silent defiance, the single sunflower that had become their banner. It's not the story everyone else is writing. Ben finished, his voice raw. It's not another death of the family farm eulogy. It's about the fight. It's about what people do when they're pushed to the wall and decide to push back. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Ben could hear the faint clatter of a newsroom, the distant ring of another phone. It's good color, Ben, Markham said finally, his voice weary. It's a nice little human interest piece. But where's the hook? Where's the conflict? A bunch of farmers praying to a plant isn't a story. It's a tragedy in slow motion. Unless something happens. Unless your guy in the pickup truck actually does something. He is doing something. He drove 300 miles to confront the bank. And did he get a meeting? Did they throw him out? Did the CEO come down and write him a check? What's the next beat of the story, Ben? Because right now, all you've got is a mood. Markham's words were a bucket of cold water. He was right. Ben had the beginning of a story, a powerful one, but it was incomplete. He had the thesis, but he lacked the evidence. He was so focused on the soul of Oakhaven that he had forgotten the cold mechanics of narrative. Villain, victim, conflict. Frank's cynical mantra echoed in his head, but this time it sounded less like a compromise and more like a roadmap. To tell the story of the farmer's strength, he had to show the true nature of the force they were up against. You're right, Ben said, a new resolve hardening his voice. I need the next beat. I need to go to the bank. Now you're talking, Markham grunted. Get me something real. Get me a quote from the guy in the suit. Get me a picture of your farmer getting thrown out on his ass. Get me a goddamn story, Carter. Then we'll talk. The line went dead. Ben stared at the blank wall of the motel room. A roadmap. He grabbed his camera bag, his keys, and his press pass, a worthless piece of plastic now, but it still looked official. He didn't know what he was going to do when he got to the Agribank Tower, but he knew he couldn't stay here, waiting for the story to come to him. He had to go hunt it down. He had to go to the 42nd floor. The office was colder than the lobby. The air itself seemed to have been polished to a frictionless sheen. Arthur Reynolds did not rise as they entered. He simply watched them approach his desk, his eyes cool and analytical, like a biologist studying a new species of insect. He gestured to the two chairs. Mr. Walker, Mr. Miller, please sit. The chairs were comfortable, but as Reynolds had intended, they were low. Elias and David found themselves looking up at him, a subtle but immediate establishment of hierarchy. Elias settled into the chair, his large frame looking out of place against the minimalist Italian design. David perched on the edge of his hands clutching his knees, his knuckles white. I'll be frank, Reynolds began, forgoing any pleasantries. I'm a busy man. Your file, Mr. Walker, is on my desk. I've reviewed it. The situation is unambiguous. He used the word unambiguous, like a weapon, a sterile, final judgment that left no room for argument or appeal. The numbers don't lie, he continued, tapping a single finger on a folder. Loan defaults, declining asset value, projected unsustainability due to meteorological trends. From a purely financial perspective, your farm is no longer a viable entity. It's a liability. David flinched at the words, as if he'd been struck. Asterisk non-viable entity. Liability. Asterisk this was the language that had erased his own farm, his history, his identity. It was the sterile, bloodless verdict that had left him a ghost in his own life. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Elias, however, was unmoved. He met Reynolds's gaze without anger, without fear, with a calm so profound it seemed to be its own form of power. "You see numbers, Mr. Reynolds," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the room's chill. "We see our home. You see a liability. I see the place my grandfather put his hands in the dirt and decided to build a life. I see the place my father taught me how to read the sky. I see the place I'm teaching my son what it means to belong to the earth." Reynolds gave a small, impatient sigh. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Walker. I truly do. But sentiment doesn't service a debt. Agribank is not a charity. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. You also have a responsibility to the people whose lives are built on the money you lend." David Miller suddenly found his voice. It was cracked and raw, filled with a pain so deep it was almost a physical presence in the room. "You did this to me. 6 months ago. Same words. Same meeting with a man in a suit just like you. You called my farm a non-performing asset. 150 years my family worked that land. My great-great-grandfather cleared it with a mule and an axe. You erased it with a pen." David was trembling, but he pushed on, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of grief and rage. "Do you know what it's like to explain to your little girl why you have to leave her home? Why the tractor you used to give her rides on is being loaded onto a flatbed by strangers? It's not a number, Mr. Reynolds. It's a wound. It's a wound you inflict on people from an office 42 floors in the sky, and you never have to watch them bleed." For the first time, a flicker of something disturbed the calm surface of Reynolds's composure. Not sympathy, but annoyance. The neat, clean lines of the meeting were being smudged by this messy, emotional outburst. "Your situation is regrettable, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But it is the consequence of a business decision, nothing more." The contract was clear. He turned his attention back to Elias, dismissing David completely. "As it is with you, Mr. Walker. Now, I did not have to grant you this meeting. I did so as a courtesy. I am prepared, as a final gesture of goodwill, to offer you a 30-day extension on your payment. That should give you sufficient time to arrange for the liquidation of your equipment and find alternative housing." It was an executioner offering his victim a choice of last words. An insult wrapped in the language of benevolence. David slumped in his chair, defeated. The machine was implacable. You could scream at it, bleed on it, but it would not feel. It would only process. But Elias did not look defeated. He looked as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He slowly leaned forward, his calloused hands resting on the cool glass surface of Reynolds's desk. "We didn't come here to ask for an extension," he said quietly. "We came here to make you an offer." Reynolds's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, followed by a flicker of amusement. "An offer? Mr. Walker, you are in no position to be making offers." Elias didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket. For a tense moment, Reynolds's eyes narrowed, a primal instinct flashing behind the corporate veneer. What was he reaching for? A weapon? But what Elias pulled out was far stranger. It was a small, hand-stitched leather pouch, worn soft with age. With a low, deliberate movement, he loosened the drawstring and turned the pouch over. Onto the pristine, reflective surface of the obsidian glass desk, he poured a small mound of dry, pale dirt. The silence in the room was absolute. The little pile of earth sat there, a universe of dust and grit, a flagrant violation of the office's sterile perfection. It was a piece of Oakhaven. It was dry, exhausted, and by any rational measure, worthless. Reynolds stared at the dirt, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "This is my collateral," Elias said, his voice resonating with a strange authority. "This is the dirt my family has worked for 3 generations. It holds the sweat of my grandfather and the prayers of my wife. It's raised my crops, and it's buried my dead. It's fed my family and my neighbors. In your world, it's worth nothing. In mine, it's worth everything." He looked Reynolds directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "This is our offer. You hold the paper. We hold the land. We're not leaving. You want our farm? You can't have it with a signature on a piece of paper. You'll have to come and take it. You'll have to get your hands dirty. It was not a plea. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. A line being drawn not in the sand, but in the very soil they stood to lose. For a long moment, Reynolds was speechless. He stared at the dirt, then at the face of the man who had put it there. He had dealt with angry debtors, weeping debtors, even threatening debtors. He had never dealt with this quiet, illogical, absolute defiance. It was a language he did not speak, a value he could not calculate. Then, the moment passed. The corporate mind reasserted control. The anomaly was identified, classified, and dismissed. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, contemptuous power. He leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Walker," he said, the amusement evident in his voice. "This has been theatrical. But Agribank is not in the business of theology. We are in the business of finance." He reached for his intercom. "Thank you for coming. The 30-day extension is on the table until the end of the day. I'd advise you to take it. Security will show you out." The meeting was over. Elias stood up slowly, followed by David, who seemed to be in a daze. Elias gave one last look at the small pile of dust on the vast, empty desk. A tiny, earthen embassy in a foreign land. An offering that had been refused. As they turned to leave, Reynolds spoke one last time, his voice laced with a final, dismissive barb. "And Mr. Walker," he said, "have someone clean that up on your way out." The assistant was waiting for them outside the door, his face impassive. He led them back to the elevator in silence. As the steel doors closed, separating them from the 42nd floor, David finally looked at Elias, his face a mixture of awe and despair. "What have we done?" he whispered. Elias looked at his own hands, the ingrained dirt in the creases of his palms. "We told him the truth," he said. "Now we go home and fight." Down in the lobby, Ben Carter stepped out of a taxi. He looked up at the immense, soulless tower of glass and steel, a camera in his hand and a question in his heart. He was just in time to see two dusty farmers, one walking with a heavy, resolute tread and the other with a new, unfamiliar spark of anger in his eyes, push through the revolving doors and step back into the harsh light of the sun. The story was no longer in Oakhaven. It was here, and it was just getting started. Chapter 7. The Cracking of the Sky. The revolving door spun them out of the refrigerated tomb and into the furnace of the street. The city air, thick with exhaust and the radiant heat of 1,000,000 tons of concrete, was a physical blow after the sterile chill of the Agribank Tower. David Miller staggered a step, blinking against the brutal afternoon sun, his body trying to reconcile the two opposing worlds he had inhabited in the space of an hour. He was a deep-sea fish hauled too quickly to the surface, crushed by the sudden change in pressure. Elias Walker simply stood on the pavement, his shadow a short, defiant patch on the gray expanse. He looked up, not at the impossible height of the building they had just exited, but past it, to the sliver of bleached white sky visible between the steel canyons. He was a farmer checking for rain, an instinct as deep and unconscious as breathing. A voice cut through the street's cacophony. "Mr. Walker? Mr. Miller?" They turned. A man in a rumpled shirt was hurrying towards them, a camera bag slung over his shoulder. He looked frayed and driven, his eyes holding a hunter's intensity. It was Ben Carter. "My name is Ben Carter. I'm a reporter," he said, fumbling for a press pass that looked as worn as he did. "I was in Oakhaven. I saw what happened at the creek bed. I need to know what happened in there." He gestured with his head towards the tower. David looked at him with raw, hollowed-out eyes. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. We spoke to the mountain, and the mountain didn't move. It's over." The spark of anger he'd carried out of the building had already been extinguished by the vast, oppressive scale of the city. Despair was flooding back in. "It's not over," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned his gaze from the sky to the reporter. His eyes, accustomed to judging the character of men and livestock, took Ben Carter's measure. He saw the exhaustion, but he also saw the hunger. This was not a man who would file a neat, sterile report. This was a man looking for a story's heart. He offered us 30 days, Elias said. Time to sell what's left and walk away. And you accepted? Ben asked, his pen already hovering over a notepad. Elias looked down at his own hands, at the faint lines of Oakhaven dirt still etched into his skin. He opened his palm, as if showing the reporter the invisible weight he carried. I made him a counteroffer. Ben leaned in, his focus absolute. What was it? I gave him the only thing we have left to give, Elias said. He looked past Ben, his gaze seeming to travel the 300 miles back home. I gave him our dirt. Ben Carter froze, his pen still poised. Dirt. The word hung in the humid city air, an alien concept. It was a word that didn't belong here, on this street of polished stone and shimmering glass. In that single word, Ben saw it all, the absurdity, the poetry, the raw, earthy defiance of their gesture. It was the hook. It was the conflict. It was the goddamn story. He put it on his desk, David added, his voice a low, wondering murmur, as if he were still seeing it. Right on his shiny black desk. A pile of Oakhaven dust. Ben started writing, his hand flying across the page. He didn't need a quote from the man in the suit anymore. He had something better. He had the image that would define the entire conflict. A handful of dust against a mountain of glass and steel. He had his narrative. He told us to have it cleaned up on our way out. David finished, the final humiliation landing like a punch. Ben stopped writing. He looked from David's wounded face to Elias's stoic calm. He felt a surge of cold, professional rage. It was the kind of detail that turned a story from an article into an indictment. Thank you, Ben said, his voice tight. I have to go. Where will you be? We're going home, Elias said simply. There's work to be done. As the two farmers turned and began their long walk back to the distant parking garage where they'd left their truck, Ben Carter was already moving in the opposite direction, dialing his phone. He walked past the impassive security guards and into the lobby, the magnificent, sterile space that Elias and David had just traversed. He saw the digital ticker, the cool marble, the silent, efficient assistants. And he understood that this place, this temple of commerce, was not just the setting of the story. It was one of the main characters. The villain. Markham. He barked into the phone when his old editor picked up. It's Carter. I have it. And you're not going to believe it. Up on the 42nd floor, Arthur Reynolds III stared at the small pile of dirt on his desk. It was an obscenity, a contamination. The longer he looked at it, the more his initial amusement curdled into a cold, focused anger. It was a gesture of profound disrespect, not just to him, but to the entire world he represented. It was a peasant's superstitious totem placed on the altar of pure reason. He pressed the intercom, his voice clipped and sharp. Cynthia, send facilities up to my office immediately. There's been a spill. He couldn't bring himself to say what it was. To name it would be to give it a substance, a significance he refused to acknowledge. A few minutes later, a man in a gray jumpsuit arrived, pushing a cart with cleaning supplies. He was a small, stooped man with weary eyes who moved with the quiet invisibility of those who spend their lives tidying up after the powerful. He entered the office with his head slightly bowed. Sir, Reynolds pointed a single, imperious finger at the desk. That. Remove it. The cleaner shuffled forward. He saw the small mound of earth on the vast, black desk. He paused, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had cleaned up spilled coffee, shattered glasses, the remains of expensive lunches. He had never been called to clean up dirt. He looked from the pile of earth to the man in the $1,000 suit. For a brief, surreal moment, the two worlds of the building, the world of the 42nd floor and the world of the sub-basement boiler rooms, met over that humble pile of soil. With a sigh, the cleaner took out a miniature dustpan and brush. With a few careful, sweeping motions, he collected the offering from Oakhaven. The dirt that held the sweat of Elias's grandfather, the hopes of his wife, the future of his son. He tipped it into a small plastic trash bag, tied a neat knot, and placed it on his cart. The desk was once again a pristine, unbroken plane of black. The anomaly was erased. "Thank you," Reynolds said, a curt dismissal. "That will be all." As the cleaner left, Reynolds felt a sense of order being restored. The brief, illogical intrusion was over. He had allowed the chaos of the outside world into his sanctuary, and now it had been sanitized. He turned back to his work, to the clean, predictable mathematics of his spreadsheets. The file for Oakhaven was closed. The 30-day timer was running. Inevitability was back on schedule. He did not know, could not comprehend, that the dirt was not gone. It had merely been moved. And the story of the dirt, a far more powerful and unpredictable variable than the soil itself, was just beginning to spread. The truck ride home was a long, rumbling silence. The city's jagged skyline eventually receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless, monotonous sprawl of suburbs, which in turn gave way to the flat, open plains. The landscape grew browner, the heat more intense. They were returning to the wounded land. David Miller sat staring out the passenger window, his mind replaying the meeting. The contempt in Reynolds's voice. The final, dismissive insult. But underneath the familiar shame, a new and unfamiliar feeling was taking root. The pile of dirt on the desk had not just been a symbol for the banker. It had been a symbol for him, too. For the first time since his own farm had been taken, he hadn't felt like a victim begging for scraps. He had been part of a defiant act. It was a lost battle, he knew, but it had felt like a battle nonetheless. Something had been kindled in the ashes of his despair. Elias drove with his steady, unhurried focus, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He felt the exhaustion deep in his bones, the exhaustion of a man who has fought a battle with weapons his enemy doesn't even recognize. He had made his stand, spoken his truth. He had placed the sacred on the table of the profane, and it had been swept aside like trash. He did not know what came next. He only knew they were going home, and they would not be leaving. As they finally turned onto the long, dusty road that led into the valley, the sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the bone-dry sky in shades of bruised orange and purple. A profound stillness lay over Oakhaven. It was the stillness of a held breath. When they pulled into Elias's driveway, the first thing he saw was Anya on the porch, her face etched with a new, deeper worry. And beside her stood Mary Hemlock, and Alara, and Marcus Thorne, and a dozen other farmers and their families. They had been waiting. Word of the failed wells had spread like a fever through the valley. Elias got out of the truck, his body stiff from the long drive. Anya met him halfway, her hand finding his. "The pump is dead, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Thorns, the Millers, they're all going. The community hall pump is all we have left." Elias nodded slowly, the news landing not as a fresh blow, but as another layer of weight on a burden already carried. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors. He saw their fear, their exhaustion, but he also saw that they were here. Together. They hadn't scattered to their individual miseries. They had gathered. "What happened, Elias?" Marcus Thorne asked, his voice rough. "What did the bank say?" Elias looked at the small crowd, at the families he had known his entire life. He told them everything. The cold office, the man behind the desk, the sterile words of finance that condemned their world. He told them about the meaningless 30-day extension. And then, his voice dropping but gaining a strange power, he told them about the dirt. A silence fell over the yard as he finished. No one spoke. The crickets began their venaying chorus in the dry fields. In the fading light, the absurdity of the act seemed immense. A handful of dust against the citadel of capital. A prayer whispered into a hurricane. It was Alara who finally broke the silence. She stepped forward, her ancient eyes fixed on Elias. She reached out a frail, wrinkled hand and touched his arm. "You didn't offer him dirt, son," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the twilight. "You reminded him what he's forgotten. That all their money, all their buildings, all their power, it's built on the ground. They just live so high up they can't feel it anymore." She turned her gaze to the single, wilting sunflower at the edge of the creek bed. "You did right. You spoke for the land. Now we wait for the land to speak back." Ben Carter wrote like a man possessed. He didn't go back to his motel. He found an all-night diner, ordered a black coffee he never touched, and opened his laptop. The story poured out of him, raw and urgent. He bypassed the usual wire service neutrality, the carefully balanced quotes, the bloodless recitation of facts. He wrote with a point of view. He wrote with passion. He framed the story as a tale of two worlds. He described the 42nd floor, its refrigerated air, its abstract art, its master of the universe who saw the world as a spreadsheet. Then he described Oakhaven, the cracked earth, the dying wells, the quiet dignity of a people facing erasure. And at the center of it all, he placed the image. The single, powerful, undeniable image. A farmer's calloused hand pouring a mound of worthless, priceless dirt onto the polished obsidian desk of the man who owned his future. He gave the story a title that had come to him in a flash of inspiration on the sidewalk. An offering of dust. He attached a photo he had taken of Elias in the creek bed, his face weathered and resolute, the dying sunflower behind him. He wrote a brief, desperate email to David Markham. Run this as is. Don't change a word. This isn't a story. It's a goddamn fable. He hit send. He sat back, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He had done it. He had thrown his own handful of dust at the machine. Now, all he could do was wait. The call from Markham came 3 hours later, just before dawn. Ben snatched the phone. "Did you get it?" "I got it." Markham's gruff voice came back, but it sounded different. "Charged. We're running it. Front page of the digital edition. I've already got calls from the Nationals. They're picking up the wire." "Ben, what the hell did you stumble into out there?" "The truth," Ben said, watching the first gray light of dawn touch the city skyline. "For once, I stumbled into the truth." The story broke like a fever. By sunrise, #offering of dust was trending on social media. The image of the dirt on the desk was a perfect, viral symbol. It was David and Goliath for the 21st century. It was simple, elemental, and deeply human. People who didn't know the first thing about agricultural loans or foreclosure law understood a handful of dirt. They understood the arrogance of the man who saw it as trash. Ben's article was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Other news outlets, smelling blood in the water, descended. News vans, a sight Oakhaven hadn't seen in decades, began rumbling down the valley road. The story was no longer about a bank and a debtor. It was about the soul of a country, about the widening chasm between the world of Wall Street and the world of Main Street, between the people who worked the land and the people who owned the paper. In his office, Arthur Reynolds watched the storm build with a sense of detached disbelief, which quickly hardened into incandescent fury. His name, his company, was being dragged through the mud. That farmer's theatrical, pathetic gesture had become a weapon turned against him. His phone was ringing incessantly with calls from board members, from shareholders, from the PR department, which was in full-blown panic. His world of clean, predictable mathematics had been shattered. He was being judged not on his profit margins, but on his character. He was being cast as the villain in a cheap melodrama. The narrative, that messy, unpredictable variable he so disdained, had slipped its leash and was now tearing his reputation to shreds. He would not allow it. He would reassert control. He would show them what real power was. This was no longer about a single, non-performing asset. It was about making an example. He made 2 calls. The first was to the bank's lead counsel. "The 30-day extension is revoked. I want foreclosure proceedings expedited. Immediately." The second was to the county sheriff. He used a private number, the number of a man whose campaigns Agribank had generously funded for years. "Sheriff, it's Arthur Reynolds. We have a situation in Oak Haven. I need you to serve eviction notices and secure our asset today." He hung up the phone. Let the media watch. Let them film it. He would show them the inevitable, mathematical conclusion. Paper always beat dirt. The dust cloud came first, a plume rising from the valley road. Then came the sound of engines, too many of them. The people of Oak Haven, gathered near the community hall to ration water from the old hand pump, turned as one. 2 sheriff's cars and a pair of large, unmarked vans were coming. There was no panic, no shouting, just a slow, grim understanding. They had known this was coming. Elias Walker wiped his hands on his jeans and turned to face the approaching vehicles. David Miller stood beside him, his hands clenched into fists, but his face was set, resolute. Anya gathered Leo into her arms. Alara stood tall, her hand resting on the old, dry wood of the pump handle. The rest of the community fanned out behind them, a silent, human wall across the road. The sheriff's cars pulled to a stop. Sheriff Brody, a heavy-set man whose face was already slick with sweat, got out of the lead car. He was holding a sheaf of papers. He looked at the silent crowd, at the faces he had known his whole life, and his expression was a mask of weary regret. "Elias," he said, his voice carrying in the still air, "don't make this difficult. I have a court order. You all have to vacate the properties." "This is our home, Bill," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "We're not leaving. I don't have a choice in the matter." The sheriff sighed, gesturing to the papers. "It's the law. There's a law of the land, and there's the law of the sky." Alara's voice cut through the tension. "You're enforcing the wrong one." From behind the sheriff's cars, Ben Carter and a cameraman scrambled out of a rental car, their equipment already rolling. They had been trailing the news vans and had seen the sheriff's convoy turn towards the valley. Ben knew this was the final act. Sheriff Brody saw the cameras and swore under his breath. He saw the crowd, unmoving, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. He saw his friend, Elias Walker, standing at their head. He saw a situation spiraling out of his control. 2 deputies got out of the second car, their hands resting uneasily on their service weapons. The standoff stretched. The air was thick, heavy, charged with unspoken history and imminent violence. The only sounds were the hum of the news cameras and the whirring of the cicadas, a sound like a frayed nerve. And then, another sound began. It was a low, distant rumble. Not an engine. It was deeper, more elemental. It was the sound of thunder. Everyone, from the farmers to the deputies to Ben Carter, looked up at the sky. The bleached white dome of the heavens was no longer empty. On the western horizon, a bruise of dark purple clouds was gathering, piling up on itself with an impossible speed. A flicker of lightning, silent and stark, illuminated the growing mass. The wind began to shift. The hot, dusty breeze that had plagued the valley for months died away, replaced by a sudden, cool updraft that smelled of ozone and wet earth. It rustled the dry leaves on the cottonwood trees, a sound the valley had almost forgotten. Another rumble of thunder, closer this time, a deep-throated growl that vibrated in their chests. The sunlight began to fade, not with the gentle dimming of evening, but as if a great curtain were being drawn across the sky. A single, fat drop of rain splattered in the dust at Elias Walker's feet, creating a dark, perfect circle. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the drizzle became a downpour, the downpour a deluge. The sky didn't just open, it cracked. It was a biblical rain, a gully-washing, drought-breaking torrent that hammered the tin roofs, churned the dusty road to mud, and soaked the unmoving people of Oak Haven to the bone in an instant. They didn't run for cover. They stood their ground, lifting their faces to the heavens, letting the first real rain in 142 days wash the dust from their skin. Leo whooped with joy in Anya's arms. David Miller felt tears mixing with the rain on his face, a release of grief and gratitude so profound it brought him to his knees. Sheriff Brody stood frozen, the court order in his hand, already a sodden, pulpy mess, the ink running in black rivers down his wrist. He looked at his deputies, who were staring at the sky in awe. He looked at the news cameras, their lenses now beaded with water. He looked at the people of Oakhaven, standing not in defiance of him, but in communion with the storm. He couldn't do it. He couldn't evict these people. Not now. Not like this. To try and force them from their homes as the heavens themselves seemed to be blessing them would not be an act of law. It would be an act of blasphemy. The optics were impossible. The morality was impossible. He slowly lowered his hand, letting the ruined papers fall into the mud. He turned to his deputies. "Pack it up," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "We're leaving." Ben Carter kept the camera rolling, capturing the image of the sheriff's cars making a slow, muddy retreat, their red and blue lights flashing uselessly against the gray wall of rain. He then turned the camera back to the people of Oakhaven, who were now embracing, laughing, crying, their small, defiant community standing unbowed in the heart of a miracle. He had his ending. Epilogue. 3 months later. The land was green. Patches of new grass, vibrant and stubborn, had taken root along the banks of the creek, which now gurgled with a steady, if modest, flow of water. The air was clean, washed by a season of gentle, consistent rains. The great drought had broken. The story of the Oakhaven stand, broadcast live during the storm, had become a national sensation. Agribank, faced with a public relations apocalypse and immense political pressure, had announced an indefinite review of all foreclosure proceedings in drought-affected areas. The legal battle was far from over, but the guillotine was no longer hanging over their heads. They had won a reprieve. They had won time. Ben Carter won a prestigious award for his reporting. His story, An Offering of Dust, was now being developed into a documentary. He had his career back, but it was a different career. He no longer chased ambulance fires. He looked for the quiet stories of dignity and defiance in forgotten places. David Miller had not gotten his farm back, but he had found something else. He had become a fierce and articulate advocate for the Oakhaven Farmers Cooperative they had formed, negotiating with suppliers, fighting their legal battles, his anger now forged into a focused and potent tool for his community. On a cool autumn afternoon, Elias Walker stood at the edge of his field. The earth was soft and dark under his boots. In his hand, he held a small, cloth bag. Anya and Leo walked up to join him. He looked at the spot where the lone sunflower had stood. It was gone now, its long season over, its great head bowed to the earth one final time. But Elias had been there before the first frost. He had carefully harvested the seeds. Hundreds of them, each one a tiny, perfect promise. He handed the bag to Leo. "Go on," he said softly. Leo reached into the bag and took out a single, striped seed. He knelt down, and with his small finger, he poked a hole in the damp soil. He dropped the seed in and carefully covered it up, patting the earth with the flat of his hand, just as he had seen his father do 1,000 times. Elias looked out across his land, at the healing green, at the patient sky. He knew the fight wasn't over. The bank was a sleeping giant, not a slain one. The weather was a fickle friend. The future was as uncertain as it had ever been. But as he watched his son plant a seed in the rich, dark soil of their home, Elias Walker knew they had more than just dirt beneath their feet. They had a foundation, and on that, they could rebuild anything. Of course, here is a short outro for the story. And so, from the simple, whispered prayer of a young boy, a community found its strength, a father found his courage, and a thirsty land found its relief. This story is a beautiful reminder that faith is not just about waiting for a miracle, but about acting with hope, even when all seems lost. The greatest miracles often begin not with a thunderclap from the sky, but with a whisper from the heart that inspires others to stand together. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. If you were moved by the story of Elias, Leo, and the people of Oakhaven, and you want to hear more incredible tales of faith and divine intervention, please take a moment to subscribe to the Prayer Miracles channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a story that can uplift and inspire. Until next time, may your faith be your foundation.